don't sign anything. If you still want to see the kids? I was standing in the kitchen, my hand lightly shaking as I held the phone, listening to my daughter's voice, the daughter who had disappeared from my life more than 15 years ago. Say those words as if I were a stranger. That sentence didn't just stop me in my tracks. It forced me to face a question I had avoided for half my life, whether what I had been doing for the past 16 years was truly protection or just holding on. Families sometimes don't fall apart because of great evils, but because of small things left unattended for too long. I used to believe that as long as I stayed, as long as I didn't leave like others did, everything would somehow be okay. But if even staying can cause harm, then where is the line? I asked myself that question right there in my old kitchen, where the smell of morning coffee still lingered in the air. And then I understood. This didn't start with today's phone call. It started in a winter long ago when I had just turned 51. If you're listening to this story from some city out there, leave me a comment and let me know. And if you've ever witnessed or lived through fragile boundaries in a family, tap like so this story can reach more people. I also want to be clear about something from the very beginning, before going any further. The story I'm telling isn't meant to confirm any objective truth, and it certainly isn't meant to judge right or wrong. It's been pieced together and edited from life experiences, looked back on through my own memories and personal feelings. Memory, as you know, isn't always perfect. I'm telling this to reflect, not to judge, and definitely not to encourage anyone to follow any of the choices in this story. That year, I had been retired for a few months. My name is Maggie Holloway, a widow living in a small Midwestern town where winters are long and so quiet you can almost hear the snow settling on the windowsill. My husband died young from a stroke. My children were grown, each living their own lives somewhere else. The two-bedroom house suddenly felt far too large for one person. In those first months of retirement, I tried to fill my days with small routines. Waking early to make coffee, walking around the neighborhood, reading the print newspaper like I had done for 30 years while working. If I had to describe my life back then in one word, it would be calm. Until one December afternoon when Laura appeared at my front door. She didn't knock hard or urgently. When I opened the door, Laura stood there with two children, a boy and a girl bundled in thick scarves. She looked thinner than I remembered, her eyes carrying the kind of exhaustion you see in someone who's traveled a very long way without rest. "Mom," Laura said, her voice quick and low, "I just need you to help me for a little while. Just a few weeks. I need to get myself together." I didn't ask, get together what? And I didn't ask how long a few weeks really meant. I simply opened the door wider, a reflex left over from when she was still a child. The two kids stepped inside, their shoes covered in snow, their hands gripping each other tightly. They didn't cry or speak, just looked around my living room as if trying to memorize a strange place. Laura set a small duffel bag beside the couch and handed me a set of keys. "I'll call," she said. "I promise I'll call." No paperwork, no agreement, no clear promise beyond a few weeks. Just the cold keys in my hand and a vague unease creeping up my spine. But I didn't stop Laura. I didn't ask more questions. I didn't even hold her for as long as a mother probably should. I just stood there watching her turn and walk back into the snow, telling myself she'd be back soon. In those first days, I lived in a state of waiting. I left Laura's bedroom untouched, afraid to disturb anything. I kept my phone close at all times, even when I was in the kitchen or out in the yard. The children stayed, quiet in a way that was almost unsettling. The older boy, Ethan, I remembered, tried hard to act strong. The younger one, Lily, startled awake from her sleep. I comforted them, cooked simple meals, told old stories I'd forgotten I even knew. A few weeks passed quickly. Then Christmas came. Laura called once, said things were not ready yet, and asked me to give her more time. I said okay, my voice sounding strangely calm to my own ears. I hung 2 extra stockings by the fireplace and wrote the kids' names on them in red marker as if they had always belonged there. Winter dragged on. Snow melted, then fell again. The kids started school near my house. My name appeared on school forms, first as grandmother, then simply as guardian. I signed without thinking much, knowing someone had to. Laura called less and less. Every call came with a different explanation, but always the same ending. I'm not ready yet. I began adjusting my life without noticing. I stopped taking long morning walks because I had to make breakfast. I no longer finished the newspaper because I was interrupted by small questions. I stopped long phone calls with old friends because evenings were for homework. It all happened so naturally, like slipping back into a role I once knew well. Some nights when the house was quiet, I sat alone in the living room and wondered if I was doing the right thing. I wasn't angry at Laura. I didn't see myself as a martyr. I just felt a low, steady worry, like standing on a bridge without seeing either end. But then morning came. Ethan and Lily woke up, and those questions were pushed aside. Late one evening, while searching for spare batteries in Laura's old drawer, my hand touched something cold and solid. It was Laura's old phone, the kind no one uses anymore. The screen was dark, but when I pressed the button, a notification appeared. A draft message. Never sent. I stood there a long time, the phone in my hand, and for the first time in years, I felt that maybe I had missed something more important than simply staying. I put Laura's old phone back in the drawer, closing it very gently, as if even the smallest sound might shatter something fragile inside me. That night, I barely slept. Not because of the unsent message, but because I realized I had stopped waiting for a specific timeline. A few weeks had become a blurry idea, drifting somewhere between rushed breakfasts and exhausted evenings. My retirement income wasn't much. After paying the mortgage, utilities, and insurance, there was just enough left for one person living carefully. With 2 kids, I had to recalculate everything. I learned to shop seasonally, switch familiar brands for cheaper ones, cut back on small social outings I once enjoyed. I didn't feel like I was sacrificing. I was just managing, like any adult does when life quietly places another responsibility in their hands. My mornings started earlier. I woke Ethan and Lily, helped them into coats and scarves, and walked them to the bus stop in the biting cold. Some days, I watched the bus disappear down the snowy road and wondered where Laura was at that moment. But that question usually faded quickly, replaced by the mental list of things to do. Buy cold medicine for Lily, apply for reduced school fees, call the clinic. At school, I grew used to the curious looks. At my first parent meeting, I sat slightly off to the side as if I were only temporary. The teacher smiled kindly and called my name, but the line where the kid's mother's name should have been remained blank. I didn't correct it. I didn't explain. I just answered questions about grades, health, and the things that were immediate and concrete. At the clinic, the nurse called my name when it was our turn. "Relationship to the patient?" she asked, still typing. "Grandmother," I answered. After a while, the question disappeared. My name was automatically listed as the primary contact. I signed consent forms without my hands shaking like they had the first time. Everything changed gradually, without a single moment big enough to mark the shift. Midway through that school year, during a short after-hours meeting, Ethan's teacher looked at me, tilted her head slightly, and asked casually, "Where's their mother?" The question wasn't sharp or intrusive. It came out of habit. I was quiet for a few seconds, feeling my heartbeat slow. Then I said, evenly, "I'm here." The room paused for a brief moment, long enough for me to realize that the answer was both true and not entirely. Driving home that day, I thought a lot. I had never intended to take Laura's place. I never thought of myself as the kid's mother in the biological sense. But I couldn't deny that I had begun filling the space she left behind. And with that came a new worry. Was my presence quietly becoming an irreversible replacement? Children, I realized, don't ask who gave birth to them. They ask who stays when they need someone. I believed that, believed presence mattered more than titles. But I also began to wonder, if Laura came back one day, what would my place in Ethan and Lily's lives be? And more importantly, was I doing something that made that return harder? Laura sent money sometimes, not regularly, not much, never with an address or explanation. Sometimes it was enough to cover groceries for a week, sometimes just a few dozen dollars, like a reminder that she still remembered. I didn't ask questions. I didn't save envelopes or receipts as proof. I treated it as something private between Laura and me, not something to measure or balance. Some people suggested I contact family services to make things official. I listened, but chose silence. Not because I feared complications, but because I wasn't ready to name what was happening. Once you name something, you have to face its consequences. And at that time, I just wanted everything to keep moving, even if I didn't know where it was going. Time passed quietly. A few weeks turned into a few years without me noticing where the boundary had been crossed. I stayed in the same house, made coffee every morning, stood at the bus stop in winter cold. But deep inside, I began to understand that I had crossed an invisible line, not with one big decision, but with hundreds of small ones, each reasonable in its moment. That's when I realized some boundaries aren't marked by signs or paperwork. They only appear once you've gone too far to turn back. I didn't tell anyone I was tired, not because I wasn't, but because I didn't know how to say it properly. In a small town like this, people know each other through quick greetings on porches, polite questions at the post office or grocery store. "How are you, Maggie?" I always nodded, smiled, said things were fine, and in some ways, that wasn't entirely a lie. I still woke up each morning, cooked dinner, took the kids to school, but some afternoons, when I closed the door behind me, I felt the weight settle clearly on my shoulders. I hid that exhaustion out of habit. I didn't complain to neighbors or call old friends to vent. I was afraid that if I said it out loud, it would become something too big to ignore, and I wasn't ready for that. I just wanted to keep everything manageable, even though deep down I knew I was unsteady. At home, life slowed into a new rhythm. Ethan and Lily grew used to it. They knew where to leave their shoes, when to turn off the TV, which evenings I liked to read in my armchair. One night, while I was washing dishes, Lily ran into the kitchen, wrapped her arms around my legs from behind, and whispered, "Mom." I turned quickly, my heart pounding. I corrected her right away, almost by reflex. "Call me Grandma, sweetheart." Lily looked up, a little confused, then nodded and ran off like nothing had happened. But later, I stopped correcting them. Sometimes Ethan called me Mom when he needed help with homework. Sometimes Lily said it in the middle of the night after a nightmare. I heard it. I knew it. And I stayed silent. I told myself it was just a habit, that it didn't mean anything deeper. But each time, a feeling rose in me that was hard to name, warm and heavy at the same time. One evening, sitting alone in the living room after the kids were asleep, I blamed myself for not correcting it again. I wondered if my silence was a kind of quiet consent. I loved them, that I couldn't deny. But I was also afraid. Afraid I was going too far. Afraid that one day Laura would return and find something had changed beyond repair. And in that fear, there was guilt. Guilt because I knew I wasn't entirely innocent in this closeness. Laura still called, but rarely. The calls were short, her voice tired, as if she were speaking while doing something else. She asked about the kids' health, a few general questions about school. I answered just enough. When I waited for words like, "I'm coming back soon," or "I'm trying to arrange things," she always changed the subject or ended the call with a rushed excuse. I didn't push. I didn't ask about money or dates. I didn't want to be pressure, and I didn't want to hear promises she might not even believe herself. Sometimes, after hanging up, I stared at the phone for a long time, wondering if my silence was another form of avoidance. Then I reminded myself that everyone moves at their own pace, and some questions asked too early only make things messier. I started writing in an old notebook with a worn cover, bought from a discount store. I didn't write every day. Sometimes weeks passed without a word, sometimes just a few lines before bed. I didn't write to accuse anyone or catalog Laura's absences. I wrote to understand myself, to name feelings I didn't have time to face during the day. In those pages, I admitted to myself that I loved Ethan and Lily deeply, but with fear woven through that love. I wrote about small moments that made me feel more like a mother than a grandmother, and I wrote about the quiet worry that, if I wasn't careful, that love could turn into a kind of replacement I never consciously chose. Some nights, when the wind rattled the windows and the house made the familiar sounds of age, I sat on my bed with the notebook on my lap and wondered whether I was doing the right thing, or just the easiest thing. I didn't have a clear answer. I only knew that the next morning I would wake up early, make breakfast, and see the kids out the door. And in that routine, I slowly realized there were things I didn't tell anyone, not because they weren't important, but because I wasn't brave enough to face them yet. Everything shifted on a morning that seemed ordinary. I was folding laundry when the phone rang. It was the school. The secretary's voice was a little rushed, trying to stay calm but clearly worried. Ethan had slipped during recess and scraped his knee. It wasn't serious, but he needed to be checked in the nurse's office. I dropped the clothes, grabbed my coat, and drove over, repeating one simple thought. It's just a small thing. At school, Ethan sat on the exam table, paler than usual, but smiling when he saw me. Lily stood beside him, holding his hand tightly. I bent down, checked the scrape, feeling both relieved and tense. The nurse handed me a stack of forms and said she needed my signature to authorize an X-ray, just in case. I took the pen, skimmed the familiar lines, then stopped at a blank space at the bottom. "Who are you on the record?" the nurse asked gently, clearly. The question froze me. I looked at the paper, then at her waiting face. In that brief moment, all the years collapsed into a single point: grandmother, temporary caregiver, or simply the one who was there. I opened my mouth, ready to answer like always, but the words caught. I thought of Laura, not being there. I thought of Ethan, wincing in pain. "I'm the responsible one," I said, my voice low and slow, as if weighing each word. The nurse nodded and didn't ask anything else. She turned away to process the paperwork, leaving me with the pen and a strange sensation spreading through my body. I signed my name on the final line, my hand slightly shaking, the ink uneven. It was the first time I'd said those words out loud, and I knew, even if no one else heard, it had changed something. We went home that afternoon after the doctor confirmed it was only a minor injury. Ethan's knee was carefully bandaged. Lily was given a small candy to calm her. On the drive back, I drove slower than usual, my hands gripping the steering wheel. I didn't turn on the radio. The silence in the car was so thick I could hear my own breathing. At home, I helped Ethan into bed and made Lily a warm glass of milk. When everything settled, I went into the bathroom, locked the door, and leaned against the sink. My hands were trembling, not violently, but enough for me to realize I wasn't as composed as I'd been at school. I looked at myself in the mirror, more gray in my hair than I remembered, tired eyes still trying to look steady. I wondered when I had become ready to say, "I'm responsible," in my daughter's place, and whether it was a step I'd never be able to undo. That evening, after the kids were asleep, I sat alone in the living room with only the soft yellow light of a table lamp. I opened the drawer where I kept Laura's old papers, originally looking for health insurance information. My hand brushed against a thin stack I hadn't touched in years. Among old bills and junk mail was a set of printed pages, the corners yellowed. It was an email, not one I'd received, but a printed draft with an unfinished subject line. I recognized Laura's writing immediately, short, broken sentences, as if she'd been thinking while typing. The message stopped midway, no greeting, no signature. She wrote about feeling overwhelmed, about being afraid she wasn't good enough to come back, about believing the kids would be better off staying with me. Then it ended abruptly, as if she'd deleted the urge to hit send. I held the pages for a long time without reading them all, just staring at the opening lines. In the quiet room, a chill ran down my spine. I didn't know when Laura had written that email or why she'd printed it and left it behind. I only knew that maybe all these years I'd been seeing everything from too narrow an angle. I folded the paper, set it on the table, and sat there in silence. Outside, the wind moved through the bare branches, making that familiar winter sound. I realized that what I said that morning at school wasn't just a temporary answer. It was a sign that I had reached a crossroads I'd never prepared for. And in my hands right now was an old piece of Laura, never sent, but enough to make me understand this story was far more complicated than simply who stayed and who left. I read that email slowly, one line at a time, as if the words might disappear if I went too fast. Laura didn't write anything specific about dates or plans. There was no, "I'll be back in the spring," and there was no, "I need 6 more months." Just short, scattered sentences about exhaustion. She wrote that every morning she woke up feeling out of breath, that the thought of coming back made her hands shake so badly she couldn't even type, that she was afraid of my eyes, afraid of the neighbors' questions, afraid of having to explain why she hadn't been able to do what everyone thought was obvious. The email stopped there, with no closing, like a breath cut off mid-inhale. I folded the paper and opened it again, trying to find some sign of calculation or selfishness, but there wasn't any. Only an exhaustion spreading through everything, the kind of exhaustion that doesn't need a clear reason. And in that moment, I realized what I hadn't dared to think for years. Laura hadn't disappeared from our lives. She was hiding from herself, hiding from expectations that maybe even I had accidentally put on her shoulders. Realizing that didn't make me feel lighter right away. It made everything more complicated. Because if Laura wasn't someone who left cleanly and for good, then I had stayed with those 2 children in a murky gap, one where no one was completely right and no one was completely wrong. I sat with that email in my hands for a long time, watching the lamplight fall across the old wooden table, and I wondered how much of my daughter I had truly understood through all the years of being her mother. Some people leave not out of malice, but because they can't stand themselves. That thought came to me gently, not dramatic, but enough to make me stop. I wondered whether forgiveness needs an apology, or if sometimes forgiveness is simply accepting that the other person didn't have enough strength to stay, even if they wanted to. I also understood that my memory, like any memory, may have been worn down and rearranged by personal feeling. The story I was telling myself wasn't the full truth for everyone involved. I couldn't, and didn't want to, assign motives to Laura. I only knew how it felt to me, how I looked back at scattered pieces through the lens of someone who has lived long enough to know that things are rarely just one-sided. After that night, I didn't change my life suddenly. I still woke up early, still made breakfast, still took Ethan and Lily to school, but a new question began forming in my mind. Where is my boundary? Not the boundary between me and Laura, but the boundary between caring and replacing. I loved those 2 children, and I had no intention of leaving them, but I also didn't want to erase their mother's place by accident, even if that place was empty and fragile. I started thinking about more practical things I had deliberately avoided before, not by looking for a lawyer or filing paperwork, but by trying to understand what I could do to protect the kids while not slamming Laura's door shut. Those thoughts made me tired, but it was a different kind of tired, like sore muscles after you've pushed them too long. Instead of turning to legal processes, I went to a counselor in the next town over. She was a few years older than me, her voice low and unhurried, not quick to offer advice. I told her, not everything, but enough for her to understand the situation. I told her about the unsent email, about the guilt of being called Mom, about the fear that one day everything would collapse because I'd been standing in the wrong place. She listened, nodded, and asked me just one question. What do you want to protect most? That question stayed with me the entire drive home. I realized I didn't only want to protect the kids from instability. I also wanted to protect myself from becoming someone I never intended to become. And somewhere deep down, I also wanted to protect Laura from the feeling that she had lost everything just because she wasn't strong enough at the right moment. I put the email back in the drawer, but I no longer saw it as a heavy secret. It became a reminder that this story wasn't as simple as I once believed. I kept raising the kids, but I started paying closer attention to small signs, to questions I needed to answer more honestly, even when the answers weren't clear yet. Outside the window, winter slowly gave way to longer days. The snow melted, revealing damp ground and the first tiny buds. I knew I was entering a different stage, one where I couldn't rely only on routine and silence, but at least this time, I didn't feel like I was walking in complete darkness. Time never warns you before it decides to speed up. One day, I realized Ethan was nearly half a head taller than me, his voice noticeably deeper whenever he called down from upstairs. Lily no longer trotted along behind me. She started closing her bedroom door and playing music loud enough for me to hear, but not understand. Their teen years arrived quietly, without any single moment marking the change. It came in small shifts that added up into a distance I had to learn to accept. They knew I wasn't their biological mother. I never lied about that. From the beginning, I called Laura their mother, even as that name grew faint in everyday conversations. As he got older, Ethan started asking more, not in accusation, but with the curiosity of a child trying to piece his life together. I answered what I knew, without embellishing, without guessing. Lily listened more than she asked. Sometimes her eyes rested on me for a long time, as if weighing something she wasn't ready to say. One evening after dinner, Ethan stayed in the kitchen while I was washing dishes. He leaned against the counter, quiet for a moment, then said slowly, "You didn't give birth to me, but you never left me." He didn't raise his voice. It wasn't dramatic. It sounded like a conclusion he'd been thinking about for a long time. I stood with my back to him, my hands still in warm water, feeling my chest tighten. I didn't turn around, and I didn't answer. I just kept washing the last plate, dried my hands, and pulled out a pan to make dinner like I did every day. I didn't answer, not because I didn't know what to say, but because I was afraid my voice would shake if I spoke. Some sentences once said, "Stay with you for a long time." I needed time to place it where it belonged in my heart instead of reacting immediately. Ethan didn't repeat it. He went upstairs, leaving me alone in the kitchen with the smell of onions and hot oil gently sizzling on the stove. Laura was completely silent during those years. No calls, no texts, no money sent. That silence was different from earlier gaps. It was thicker, more sealed, like a door closed carefully and fully. I didn't know where she was or how she was living. Sometimes I thought about trying to find out, asking someone to check, but I stopped myself. I had learned that some doors, if you knock too hard, only hurt both sides. I started thinking more about Ethan and Lily's future, not the specific kind, what school, what career, but their emotional future. I wondered what would happen when I no longer had the strength to be here every day. I didn't start legal paperwork or draw up documents. I just prepared myself, and I prepared them in the ways I knew. I taught Ethan how to manage allowance money, not through long lectures, but by letting him make small mistakes. I taught Lily how to cook a few simple meals, not because she would have to fend for herself soon, but because I wanted her to know she could. I talked to them about leaving home, about the mix of excitement and fear when you step into the world. I didn't say I would always be here. I only said that wherever they went, they would always have the right to come back, even if one day I wasn't in this house anymore. On quiet evenings, when the kids were in their own corners with their own worlds, I sat in the living room reading or knitting. I thought of Laura, not with anger anymore, not with blame, but with a sadness that had softened. I wondered whether she knew how much her children had grown, what they had said, who they were becoming. But I didn't write a letter or leave a message. I didn't want to disturb a silence that Laura might need just to keep going. Sometimes, rarely, I felt like I was standing between two shores. On one side was the responsibility I'd carried for years, On the other was the truth that I couldn't keep everything intact forever. I reminded myself that everything would have to change, whether I was ready or not. Change isn't always loss. Sometimes it's simply a different shape of continuing. Late one night, I turned off the kitchen light and stood there, looking at the house in the dark. I could see the marks of time, scuffs on the walls, a chair with a loose screw, an entry rug worn thin. I could also see what couldn't be seen: attachment, words that were never answered, roles that shifted without anyone declaring them. I knew I couldn't control the future, and I couldn't fix the past. The only thing I could do was be here one more day, with a clearer awareness of my own boundaries. And with that awareness, I began to accept that what I'd called stability all those years was really just a pause before everything moved into another stage. I didn't know what that stage would look like. I only knew that when it came, I wouldn't be as shocked as before. The call came late in the afternoon while I was folding a blanket on the sofa. The last sunlight angled through the window, making dust float visibly in the air. The number on the screen wasn't saved, an unfamiliar string of digits that made me hesitate for a couple of beats before picking up. I had gotten so used to expecting nothing from this phone that the ringing sounded like it belonged to someone else's life. "Hello?" I said, my voice so normal it surprised even me. On the other end, there was a brief silence. Then Laura's voice came through. Not loud, not shaky, not like the Laura from 16 years ago. It was lower, slower, as if it had passed through many layers of exhaustion. "Mom, it's me." 2 words, but enough to make me grip the edge of the table. She didn't apologize. She didn't say she had been wrong. She didn't complain or blame anyone. She only said she wanted to talk. That word choice threw me. Talk about what, after all those years of silence? I didn't ask right away. I let Laura continue, let the rhythm of the call find its footing. "I think it's time. I should talk to you," Laura said, like she was reading a sentence she'd rehearsed many times. I could hear a familiar hesitation in her voice, the same hesitation I used to hear when she was about to say something hard. Then, without warning, Laura said something that tightened my chest. "You've done more than your part, Mom." It wasn't sharp. It wasn't accusatory. It was simply a statement laid down gently, but it felt heavy as stone. I didn't react right away. I looked out the window at the grass turning pale yellow and felt my deepest fear being touched. For years, I had asked myself whether I was doing too much, whether my steady presence had accidentally pushed Laura farther away. Hearing her say it herself, even as just one sentence, knocked me off balance for a moment. But at the same time, I realized her voice didn't carry resentment. It sounded like someone trying to set a boundary without being sure where that boundary truly was. Laura kept talking, a little faster now, as if afraid I would cut her off. She said she wasn't calling to take the kids, not calling for money, not calling to change what existed. "I just want to connect," she said. The word connect sounded strange, almost like it didn't belong to us. I wondered if she even knew what she was asking for, or if she was reaching for a safe word to cover something unsteady. I listened, but my thoughts tangled. I had gotten used to having a clear villain to face. Absence, silence, years without explanation. But now, there was no obvious bad person. No one for me to be angry at. No one for me to condemn. Just a daughter who had grown up in ways I hadn't witnessed, standing on the other end of the call, trying to open a door she herself had closed long ago. Laura didn't say much about Ethan and Lily. She asked briefly, like she was afraid to go too deep. I answered just enough. No more, no less, no boasting, no hiding. I realized I was keeping distance, not because I was angry, but because I needed to understand where I stood in this story. There was a long silence between us. I could hear Laura's breathing, steady but heavy. I knew she was waiting for me to say something, maybe reassurance, maybe pushback, but I couldn't answer right away, not because I had nothing to say, but because any answer might send everything down a path I wasn't ready to accept. "You don't have to answer me right now," Laura said, her voice softer. "I just wanted you to know." The words made my throat go dry. I nodded by reflex, then realized she couldn't see it. "I heard you," I said slowly. That was all I could say in that moment, and I knew it was true. Before hanging up, Laura took a deep breath. "If you're okay with it," she said, "we could meet in person." The last two words were barely spoken, as if she was afraid they would disappear if she said them out loud. I didn't answer immediately. I looked around the familiar room where every object belonged to a life Laura no longer fit into. I could feel hesitation pulling me in two directions. "Let me think about it," I said at last. Not a no, not a yes. Laura was quiet for a second, then said she understood. The call ended gently. No sigh, no promises. I set the phone down, my hands still a little shaky. The house was so quiet I could hear the wall clock ticking, steady and emotionless. I knew that from this moment, everything had started moving in a different way. And even though I hadn't answered, Laura's request to meet in person hung in the air like a question with no period. We agreed to meet at a small coffee shop near the highway, a place where people stopped more than they stayed. I arrived 10 minutes early, chose a table by the window, and ordered a hot tea, even though it wasn't cold outside. When Laura walked in, I recognized her immediately, but it still took a beat to match the face in front of me with my old memories. She looked tired. Not so thin it was alarming, not like someone freshly broken by tragedy. Just tired. The tiredness of someone who's been walking too long without ever stopping long enough to rest. She looked around, saw me, and paused. We both stood up almost at the same time, but we didn't hug. Just a small nod, like two people who have known each other a long time, but aren't sure whether to be close or distant. Laura sat down, slid her purse under the chair, and wrapped both hands around the cup of coffee she'd just ordered. I noticed her hands were trembling slightly, as if she was trying to keep herself steady. We started with simple opening lines. The weather, the drive, when this place had changed owners. No one mentioned 16 years right away, and I knew it wasn't avoidance so much as two people unsure how to enter a big story through a small door. Laura was the one who broke the silence. "I never thought you'd stay that long." She said it plainly, without accusation or dramatic surprise. But it felt like someone gently tapped on a door that had been shut tight inside me. I didn't argue. I didn't confirm. I just looked at her and realized there was both acknowledgement and helplessness in that sentence. In that moment, I understood that neither of us had been prepared for this. Laura hadn't been prepared to leave the kids for so long. I hadn't been prepared to be the one who stayed for that long. We had stepped into a wordless agreement, each carrying our own assumptions. And then we let time do what it does. Laura described the years in an even voice, jobs changing constantly, temporary places to live, relationships that came and went, nothing big enough to make me gasp, nothing tragic enough to explain everything, just a chain of days, one after another, not exactly failure, not exactly success either. I listened without interrupting, without trying to force cause and effect into order. When it was my turn, I did the same. I talked about Ethan and Lily, but not too much. I talked about them growing up, about ordinary changes. I didn't mention sleepless nights or the times I blamed myself, not because I wanted to hide it, but because I didn't want this meeting to become a balance sheet of merit and fault. There was a moment when Laura stopped and looked straight at me, her eyes not turning away. Suddenly, I realized she was waiting for something decisive. Maybe forgiveness, maybe a late-coming accusation. But I didn't give her either. I just sat there, feeling my daughter's presence after all those years, and let that feeling find its own place. Staying is a choice, not an instinct. That thought became very clear in me. I had chosen to stay, day after day, not because I couldn't leave, but because on each of those days, staying made the most sense. But if someone comes back late, what rights do they still have? The right to be called mom? The right to step into the lives of children who grew up without them? I didn't have an answer, and I wasn't sure an answer even existed. We didn't make any agreement. We didn't promise anything about the future. There were no tears. Laura didn't apologize, and I didn't demand one. Maybe because we both understood that some apologies, when they come too late, only make everything heavier. We ended the meeting with a light handshake, like two people who had said enough for today. On the way home, I drove slower than usual. The familiar road stretched ahead, but I felt like I was moving through it in a different state. Not relief, not pain, just emptiness, like a room had been cleared out, but nothing had been put back yet. When I opened the door and stepped inside, I paused at the threshold. The house was quiet, smelling of old wood and familiar soap. I realized that meeting hadn't closed anything, but it had opened a new space inside me. A space with no noise, no climax, only the truth that this story had moved into another chapter. And even though I didn't know where that chapter would lead, I knew I wasn't standing in the same place anymore. I didn't tell Ethan and Lily right after the meeting. I needed a few days for my feelings to settle, to make sure that when I opened my mouth, I wasn't speaking from my own confusion. One evening, after dinner, when the dishes were put away and the kitchen had returned to its familiar quiet, I asked them to sit down at the table. Not with a serious tone, and not like I was preparing some big announcement. I just said I wanted to talk, and they nodded, each in their own way. I told them about meeting their mother. No embellishing, no softening, no exaggerating. I said that Laura wanted to reconnect, that she hadn't made any demands, and that everything was still open. I stopped there and let the words find their own way. I didn't tell them what they should do. I didn't suggest any path is right. I only said this was their story, and they had the right to feel it in their own way. Ethan reacted first. He stayed quiet for a long time, staring down at the tabletop, his fingers lightly tapping the wood edge like he was counting time. Then he looked up and asked a blunt question. "What do you want us to do?" That question, even though it was short, held all the hesitation of someone standing at a crossroads. I looked him straight in the eye and answered slowly, making sure I wasn't accidentally steering him. "I don't need to be chosen," I said. "I just need you to be yourselves." The words hung in the quiet kitchen. No raised voice, no martyrdom in them. It was simply the truth it had taken me years to name. Lily was different. She didn't say anything right away. She looked at me, then at her brother, then out the window as if she were searching for something to hold on to. Finally, Lily asked softly, "If we want to see Mom, will you be sad?" The question touched a very tender place in me. I didn't answer immediately, not because I didn't know, but because I needed to be sure my answer wouldn't put more weight on her shoulders. "I might be sad," I said honestly, "but that's my feeling, not your responsibility." I watched Lily exhale in relief, as if she'd just been allowed to admit something she'd been carrying for a long time. In the days that followed, their reactions stayed different. Ethan grew quieter, spending more time in his room, listening to music and thinking. Lily asked more, small questions that went straight to the core. What their mother liked, what she used to be like, why things had turned out this way. I answered as best I could, always stopping at the boundary of guessing. I didn't want to speak for Laura, and I didn't want to paint a picture I wasn't even sure about myself. I learned how to step back, both literally and in the way it mattered. I didn't stand outside their door when they were on the phone. I didn't ask after every conversation what they'd said. I let silence have its place. That wasn't easy. Sometimes instinct pulled me forward, wanting to protect, wanting to control. But I reminded myself that love isn't always about being the closest one. No one won in those conversations. No one lost either. There was no neat closure, no shared decision made in a single evening. Just overlapping thoughts, feelings not yet named. And I slowly understood that uncertainty isn't the enemy. Sometimes it's the space each person needs to find their own rhythm. One night, after everyone was asleep, I sat alone in the living room and looked around at the familiar things. I could see traces of different seasons layered on top of each other. The years when it was only me, the years with children's laughter added in, and now this stage where everything was beginning to shift. I didn't know how it would end. I didn't know whether today's choices would pull us closer together or push us farther apart. But I knew one thing. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't trying to write a script for anyone. I wasn't trying to make this story right by some standard. I was just standing here, ready to receive whatever came, whatever shape it took. And in that acceptance, I felt a strange kind of relief, like I'd just set down a burden I'd always believed I could never put down. I knew we were getting close to a point where things would have to change more clearly. Not right now, but soon. And when that time came, I wanted to have enough calm to neither cling nor push away, just to be there, at the right time, in the right role. The decision didn't arrive in a single day, and it wasn't spoken in one sentence. It formed slowly, through long evenings, through the times Ethan stayed quiet longer than usual, through Lily's eyes whenever she looked at her brother. I didn't ask either of them first. I waited until they spoke on their own, because I had promised myself I wouldn't place more pressure on either one. Ethan was the one who spoke. One afternoon, he stood at the edge of the living room doorway, his hands in his jacket pockets, like he was about to step outside even though it wasn't dark yet. "Grandma," he said, his voice low and steady, "I want to try living with Mom for a while." I looked at him for a long time. There was no impulse in his words, no challenge, just a desire to try, to know, to experience for himself the part of life he'd been missing. Lily didn't say anything right then. She sat in her chair, gripping the hem of her shirt, her eyes fixed on the floor. I turned to her, not asking, "Are you going?" but asking, "How do you feel?" Lily looked up, her eyes wet but her voice very clear. "I want to stay." No explanation, just stay. In that moment, I felt something inside me split in two. One half wanted to keep Ethan here, wanted to say he didn't have to go anywhere to understand where he belonged. The other half understood that if I stopped him, I would only repeat another cycle. It hurt in a very quiet way, but I didn't stop him. I didn't argue, I only nodded. "I'm not holding you," I said to Ethan slowly, letting each word settle. "I'm just opening the door." I saw his shoulders loosen a little, like he'd just been given permission to breathe. Lily turned to look at me, her eyes wavering but not accusing. I placed my hand over hers, felt that familiar warmth, and knew the three of us were stepping into a hard season. Laura didn't promise anything. When I called her to tell her about Ethan's decision, Laura only said she understood. No, everything will be okay. No, don't worry, Mom. Just understood. I didn't know what that meant in real life, but I didn't ask for more. I'd learned that some promises only soothe you for a moment, then leave behind empty spaces that are hard to fill. On the day Ethan left, I helped him pack. Not much. Clothes, a few books, an old pair of headphones. We worked in silence, not because of tension, but because no one wanted to say something too big in a small room. When Laura came to pick him up, we stood on the front porch. Ethan hugged Lily very tightly, longer than I expected. Lily cried, but she didn't cling to her brother's shirt. She stood straight, like she'd decided she wouldn't make things harder. Ethan hugged me last. "I'll call," he said. I nodded and didn't add any warnings or advice. I knew if I started, I wouldn't know where to stop. When the car pulled away, I watched until it disappeared at the end of the road. Then I went inside, closed the door, and for the first time in a long time, the house felt quiet in a different way. The emptiness showed up fast, not because there was less noise, but because a familiar rhythm was missing. A mug no one used anymore, a pair of shoes no longer in the corner by the door. Lily and I adjusted our routine slowly, like two people learning how to live in a space that had changed shape. I learned to accept that this family no longer had its old form, and maybe never would again. Some evenings, after Lily had fallen asleep, I sat alone in the living room and listened to the wind outside the window. I didn't blame myself, and I didn't comfort myself either. I just let the emptiness exist, without trying to fill it. I understood that emptiness was the price of not clinging, and I accepted paying it. One morning, a few weeks later, I opened the mailbox out front like I always did. Between bills and junk mail, there was a cream-colored envelope, handwriting that felt familiar, but I had to look twice to recognize. My name was written neatly and slowly, as if the writer had weighed every stroke. I stood on the porch for a long time with the envelope in my hand, not opening it right away. I knew that whatever was inside, it would force me to take one more step into this story. And this time, I wasn't sure whether I was ready. I opened the letter in the afternoon, while Lily was still at school, and the house was so quiet I could hear the paper softly rustling in my hands. The envelope wasn't sealed with glue, just carefully folded shut. Inside were a few handwritten pages in Laura's writing, no longer as rushed as I remembered, but still with the familiar rhythm of someone who often pauses mid-sentence to think. There was no apology at the start. No, "Mom, I was wrong," and no words trying to smooth things over. Laura began by admitting her own weakness. She wrote that there had been days she woke up without the strength to even name herself, days when every choice felt heavy as stone. She wrote about the fear of coming back and discovering that everyone was better off without her, a fear that makes someone want to return and disappear at the same time. She didn't blame me, and she didn't blame circumstances. She only wrote that, at certain times, she hadn't been strong enough to do what needed to be done. I read slowly, not because the handwriting was hard, but because I wanted each sentence to have time to settle. In some parts, Laura admitted she had leaned on me, staying like a life preserver, without having the courage to ask how long that life preserver could hold. In other parts, she wrote that when she heard me say, "I'm just opening the door," she understood that some doors can't be pulled toward yourself forever. She wrote that she didn't know where the future would go, but she knew she no longer wanted to hide in silence. There were no promises in the letter, no concrete plan, no clear proposal to rebuild anything. Only an admission that she had been weak, afraid, and had chosen to retreat instead of face things. And maybe, for Laura, being able to write that down was already a long distance from 16 years ago. I folded the letter, set it on the table, and sat still. In that moment, I realized I didn't feel angry. I didn't feel the relief I'd imagined either, just a different kind of quiet, deeper, with fewer sharp edges. I knew some people need an apology to move forward. I also knew that for some, when an apology comes too late, it can't do what everyone hopes it will. For me, this letter didn't close anything. It only placed another piece of truth on the table. I didn't write back, not because I had nothing to say, but because I didn't want to turn Laura's admission into an exchange. I was afraid that if I wrote, I'd accidentally place another burden on her, a burden to respond, to promise, to repair. I chose silence not to punish her, but to give what had just been said room to breathe. I also reminded myself that my memory, what I remember, what I feel, may have been rearranged by the years. The story I tell myself is how I look back, not a sentence handed down to anyone. I wasn't certain enough to judge Laura's motives, and I didn't want to trap the past inside neat conclusions. I only knew how I had lived, and the choices I had made within what I was able to do. I put the letter in the drawer, tucked beneath old papers and my worn journal. I didn't lock it away. I didn't hide it. I just stored it there, like something that exists alongside my present life, not something that has to be mentioned every day. Life went on in small rhythms. Lily and I slowly got used to a house with fewer people in it, quieter dinners, slower mornings. I was getting older. That couldn't be denied. But with age, I felt lighter. Not because there was less to do, but because I tried less to control what was never truly mine to control. I learned to let unanswered questions stay where they were, without forcing them to answer right away. Some evenings I sat reading, yellow lamplight falling across the page, and I thought about Laura not with the urge to fix anything, but with a gentle curiosity. What kind of person she might become when she stopped running. I thought about Ethan, about the road he was trying out, and I thought about Lily, who chose to stay but wasn't required to stand still. I realized that this family, even without its old shape, still existed, imperfect but real. When I closed the drawer, I didn't know how this story would end. Maybe there would be more meetings, maybe there wouldn't. Maybe one day I'd write back, or maybe that letter would sit there for a very long time. What I knew for sure was that I no longer needed a clear conclusion in order to keep living. And maybe it was that uncertainty that brought me closer to what I'd been searching for years. A peace that doesn't come from everything being resolved, but from accepting things as they are. I returned the key on a quiet morning when the sun hadn't yet warmed the front step. Laura stood in the doorway holding a cup of cold coffee, looking at me like she was waiting for an opening line. I didn't have one. I just placed the key into her palm and slowly closed her fingers around it. No promises, no conditions, no instructions for the future, just returning something that had once been handed over at a time when we both believed it was temporary. Laura didn't ask why. She nodded lightly as if she understood some decisions don't need explaining. We stood there for a few more seconds, then I turned away. I didn't look back. Not out of coldness, but because I'd learned that in some moments, if you look 1 second longer, you'll want to hold on to more than you should. After that, time moved in a very different rhythm. Ethan visited often. He grew fast, bringing new stories, new questions that no longer searched for permission. We talked like people who know each other well, not to make up for anything, but to stay current with each other. Lily was different. She called, stopped by sometimes, but not regularly. There were long gaps, and I respected them. I understood that everyone keeps connection in their own way, some through presence, some through just enough distance. I lived alone again, not for the first time, but for the first time with a different feeling. The house no longer had to adjust to school schedules, early dinners, or late-night conversations. I rearranged things, not to erase traces, but to make room for the present. Some mornings, I made coffee for one, sat watching sunlight slide across the wooden floor, and realized I wasn't as empty as I'd once feared. I felt full in a quiet way. Our story wasn't complete. It didn't end with a family reunion meal or a promise kept perfectly, but it was real. Real in the way ordinary life usually is, with gaps, things left unsaid, and decisions without a soundtrack. I learned that family isn't about holding tight, but about knowing when to let go. Letting go isn't because the love is gone, but because you love in a way that doesn't leave someone gasping for air. Love doesn't guarantee happiness. It doesn't promise a gentle ending, but without it, everything is surely hollow. Between those two truths, I chose love with boundaries, a choice that isn't easy but necessary. I also want to say this clearly in the steady voice of someone who has lived long enough to know she can be wrong. The story you've just heard is fictional, pieced together and edited from many slices of real life and human experience, told through my memory and personal interpretation. It isn't meant to confirm objective events. It doesn't represent absolute right and wrong. It doesn't assign motives, and it doesn't encourage anyone to copy what's done here. I'm telling it to reflect, not to judge. If, in real life, you're in a similar situation, pulled between love and boundaries, seek guidance, talk early with the people involved, and set clear boundaries. Slow, kind conversations often save more than rushed decisions. Before I end, I want to thank you for staying with me this far. If you're listening from some city out there, leave me a comment and tell me where you're from. If you've walked through fragile family boundaries, held on, let go, or are learning how to do both, share your experience. Tap like if this story touched you, subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss other everyday stories. Slow, thoughtful, and not quick to conclude. Thank you for listening. Somewhere, maybe very close, I think we're all learning the same lesson. Knowing when to hold the key and when to give it back. I only receive one item. The lawyer said it while my 2 children were quietly laughing, and that laughter rang louder than my own heartbeat. On the table, In front of them was ownership of my husband's corporation, worth more than $48 million. And in front of me, there was only an old phone, locked with a password. Before I could even ask anything, my eldest son shrugged. Guess Dad left it for Mom as a keepsake. I stood up, my hands trembling as I picked up that ice-cold phone, and in that exact moment I decided I would not cry, I would not beg, and I would not explain myself. Because if this was the only thing he left me, then it had to contain something they didn't know. If you're still listening, tell me where you're watching from. Every comment you leave is another mark in this journey. And if this story has touched you, don't forget to hit like so it can reach even further. My name is Audrey White. That year, I was 67 years old, and the man who had just been divided up like a balance sheet, Richard White, had been my husband for more than 40 years. Richard was a name that made people stand up to shake hands at real estate gatherings across California. He built his empire from nothing, from empty lots along the highway to commercial projects stretching across the West Coast. People called him the man who never lost. And me? I was called his wife. I had been used to the world seeing me as an accessory for a very long time, but I never thought that even after he died, I would still be nothing more than a tiny footnote at the bottom of his will. The will reading took place at the offices of Whitman and Cole, on the 21st floor of a glass building in the middle of downtown. The conference room was large and cold, the fluorescent lights so white they made everyone's skin look paler than usual. I sat at the head of the table, my back straight, my hands folded neatly on my lap. I wore the simplest black dress I owned, no jewelry, no perfume. I didn't want to look like a widow waiting to be pitied. Evan and Lauren sat across from me. My eldest son, Evan White, leaned back in his chair, one leg crossed over the other, his phone placed neatly by his right hand. He looked exactly like Richard, from the bridge of his nose to that confident furrow in his brow. Lauren was different. She always knew how to present herself properly. Softly curled hair, an expensive black dress, her handbag placed carefully beside her chair. She didn't look at me. From the very beginning, her eyes stayed fixed on the folder in front of the lawyer. When the lawyer reached the asset distribution section, I heard each number drop onto the table like cold stones. 40% of the company shares to Evan, 35% along with ownership of the main estate to Lauren. The remaining portion divided among vacation properties, vintage cars, and investment portfolios. They nodded. They exchanged quick, subtle glances. But I noticed those were the looks of people who already knew the outcome and were simply waiting for the process to finish. I stayed still. I didn't interrupt. I didn't ask questions. I had lived beside Richard long enough to understand one thing. He never did anything without purpose. If he made me wait, then waiting was what I needed to do. Until the lawyer cleared his throat and turned to the final page. And for my wife, Audrey White. In that moment, I heard my heartbeat clearly. Not because I expected money. I was no longer young enough to dream about numbers. But after 40 years together, I believed I deserved at least an explanation. The lawyer paused briefly, as if even he found this part uncomfortable. I leave one item only, my personal phone, stored in the safe in my private office, with one mandatory condition. It must not be forced open by any means. Then silence. 1 second, 2 seconds. And then Evan laughed first. Not a loud laugh, but a short, quiet one, sharp with mockery. Lauren covered her mouth, her shoulders shaking slightly. I looked at them, and for the first time in my life, I saw it clearly. In their eyes, I wasn't their mother. I was excess detail. "It's just a phone," Evan said lightly. Dad really kept his sense of humor to the very end. I didn't respond. I looked at the lawyer instead. He avoided my eyes. "One additional clause," he said quickly, as if trying to wrap things up. "Mrs. Audrey White is permitted to remain in the estate for a period of 30 days, starting today." 30 days. 40 years of marriage, exchanged for 30 days. I nodded. Not because I agreed, but because there was nothing left to ask in that room. When the lawyer handed me the safe key, his hand trembled slightly. The key was so small it fit neatly in my palm. I took it, stood up, and felt my children's stares burning into my back. No one asked, "Mom, are you okay?" No one stood up to walk me out. I left the conference room and walked down the long glass hallway. Outside, the city carried on as if a man named Richard White had not just been buried, and as if a woman named Audrey White had not just been erased from her former life. Richard's private office was on the 18th floor, at the far end of the hall. Everything looked exactly as it had on his last day alive. The walnut desk, the unfinished project sketches, the leather chair he always used, the familiar scent of black coffee mixed with old wood. The safe was hidden behind an abstract painting I had never liked. Richard used to call it a long-term investment. I took the painting down and inserted the key. Click. The sound was so small that without paying attention, you might think it was just metal brushing against metal. Inside the safe was exactly one item, the phone. Not a new model, not a sleek smartphone. It was an older one, the plastic edges slightly worn at the corners. I picked it up. Cold. Heavier than I expected. I pressed the power button. The screen lit up. The logo appeared. And then, our wedding photo. I was younger, thinner, my eyes brighter. Richard stood beside me, his hand resting lightly on my waist, smiling with the confidence of a man who believed the world already belonged to him. Then the lock screen appeared. 6 empty circles. Password required. I tried our wedding date. Wrong. His birthday. Wrong. Evan's birthday. Wrong. Lauren's birthday. Wrong. Each wrong attempt made the phone vibrate gently, like a polite but firm refusal. I sat down in Richard's chair. The leather creaked softly beneath my weight. I looked at the phone resting in my palm, and for the first time since he died, I didn't cry. Not because I was strong, but because something deep inside me had just woken up. Richard never made jokes, and he never abandoned anything he considered important. If he left me a locked phone, it wasn't a keepsake. It was a door, and whatever truth waited behind that door, I knew one thing for certain. This phone could not be meaningless. Richard's funeral had taken place 3 days before the will reading, but it wasn't until I walked out of the law office with that cold phone in my hand that I truly returned to that moment, as if my mind needed time to accept reality before allowing the memory to surface. The funeral home was in Pasadena, an elegant place with perfectly trimmed lawns and straight rows of cypress trees leading to the main hall. Everything there was designed to feel solemn, expensive, and emotionally distant. When I walked in that day, the heavy scent of white flowers hit me immediately, turning my stomach. Richard hated flowers. He used to say they were only beautiful for a moment before dying, just like relationships built on appearances. And yet that room was overflowing with flowers, large wreaths, elaborate arrangements, ribbons bearing the names of corporations, partners, and investment funds. All names I recognized, but never truly knew. Richard's coffin sat in the center. Dark wood, meticulously polished, expensive enough that I immediately knew Evan had chosen it. My son always believed anything connected to his father had to be worthy. I stood in front of the coffin for a long time, but I didn't step closer. I didn't have the strength to look at that motionless face again. The last image of Richard I carried was of him collapsed over his desk, surrounded by unfinished drawings and contracts, an image I only learned about later, through his secretary. The service began on time. People stood and sat according to the coordinator's cues. Evan and Lauren sat in the front row closest to the aisle. I was placed in the second row, alone. At first, I thought it was a mistake. I waited. I expected someone to come sit beside me, but no one did. Not a hand reached for mine, not a whispered word of concern. I sat there, my back straight, my hands resting on my handbag, feeling like I had taken someone else's seat. I turned to look at Evan. He had his head lowered, but not in prayer. His phone rested on his lap, the screen lighting up constantly. I could clearly see names appear and disappear: lawyer, assistant, chief financial officer, bank. Evan nodded, whispered a few words, then ended the call. Lauren wasn't much different. She held her phone with both hands, fingers moving quickly, her focus so intense I knew she wasn't hearing a single word being spoken at the front. I realized that at their father's funeral, my children were working. The officiant began speaking about Richard White, a brilliant businessman, a philanthropist, a visionary. The words flowed smoothly, polished, carefully edited to avoid touching any sharp edges. No one mentioned that Richard worked 16 hours a day. No one spoke about the nights he sat alone in his office, cold coffee beside him, trying to save a failing project. No one mentioned the chest pains he ignored because the work wasn't finished yet. No one spoke of the man who died alone. I listened with an empty heart. The words weren't wrong, but they weren't right either. They were a beautiful summary written to make listeners feel comfortable, not to tell the truth. I sat there, staring at my husband's coffin, and wondered, if Richard could hear this, what would he think? He would probably smile politely. Richard was always good at that. When it was time for the family to speak, Evan stood up. He spoke briefly and efficiently, thanked the partners, emphasized that the company would continue according to his father's vision. He didn't mention me once. Lauren didn't stand. She simply lowered her head, placed her hand over her chest for a few seconds, a perfect gesture for the cameras. I wasn't invited to speak, and I didn't stand. I didn't believe there was anything I could say in that room without making things uncomfortable. I had grown used to stepping back for far too long. Throughout the service, the phone in my purse felt like a stone. I didn't have it yet, but that sensation, that weight, had appeared early. I remember gripping the strap of my bag tightly, trying to keep my hands from shaking. I thought about Richard, about the last time we spoke. Over the phone, brief, rushed. He said he'd be home late. I said I'd leave dinner in the oven. We didn't say, "I love you." We'd grown used to saving those words for later. Later never came. When the service ended, everyone stood almost at once, as if an invisible signal had been given. Evan was the first to step into the aisle. He didn't look back at the coffin. Lauren followed, answering her phone as she walked. I remained seated for a few more seconds, watching the room slowly empty, the white flowers still standing there, silent and unfamiliar. I stood up last. No one waited for me. In the reception area outside, people gathered in small clusters. I saw handshakes, polite hugs, whispered conversations about stocks, projects, and the transition period. I saw Evan standing at the center of a group, his expression serious but confident. I saw Lauren smiling softly at a woman I didn't know, her eyes bright in a way I hadn't seen in a long time. No one came to me. I stood beside a small table with coffee and cookies, holding a paper cup I didn't drink from. I felt like a shadow, present but unseen. A few people approached, offering polite condolences. "Richard was a great man. You must be very proud." I nodded, smiled appropriately, thanked them. I had done it hundreds of times in my life, smiling when expected, even when empty inside. There was only one moment that truly jolted me awake. I heard Evan speaking with a man near the door. His voice was low, but close enough. "Yes, we'll handle everything quickly. There's nothing to worry about. My father prepared everything already." Prepared. That word lodged itself inside me like a thorn. I looked at Evan, at the way he spoke, the way he stood, the way he showed no sign of having just lost his father. And for the first time, I wondered, had my children been waiting for this day longer than I realized? I left the funeral home alone. The parking lot was wide, the sun harsh, everything painfully normal. I got into my car, closed the door, and sat there for a long time before starting the engine. I didn't cry. I had cried enough in the nights before. Now I just felt tired. A deep exhaustion, not of the body, but of realizing I had been standing in the wrong place for far too long. As I drove away, the funeral home faded in the rearview mirror. Richard's funeral ended like a brief meeting. Efficient, emotionless, nothing extra. And I, the woman who had been his wife, had no place in it. That evening, when I returned home, I opened my handbag and looked at the empty space where the phone should have been. At that time, I didn't yet know I would receive it. But a very clear feeling settled in. Something about all of this was wrong. Not because of money, not because of the will, but because everything had unfolded too smoothly, too prepared, as if it had all been rehearsed in advance. I sat in the living room, warm yellow light washing over familiar walls, and thought about Richard, about the things he never said, the things he hid. And I didn't know that just a few days later, an old phone would become the first piece of evidence proving that the funeral that day was not just a farewell. It was the beginning of the truth. I returned to the mansion that afternoon, after the will reading, when the sun had already begun to sink behind the tall rows of palm trees lining the road into the neighborhood. The house was still there. Grand and familiar, just as it had been for more than 40 years. But from the moment I stepped through the iron gate, I felt something deeply different, as if this place no longer belonged to me, even though my name was still on a few documents that hadn't yet been changed. 2 days after the funeral, the lawyer sent an official email. The message was brief, precise, without a single unnecessary word. I was permitted to continue residing in the mansion for a maximum of 30 days, counted from the date of the will reading. After that period, the right to use and manage the property would be fully transferred to the primary heirs. 30 days. I read that number over and over, not because I didn't understand it, but because I couldn't believe an entire life could be compressed into it. 40 years of marriage, tens of thousands of dinners, sleepless nights because a child was sick, because Richard was under pressure at work, because projects were on the verge of collapse. All of it reduced to 30 days, enough time to pack up, enough time to disappear neatly. Lauren was the first to act. Just 3 days later, while I was still trying to keep my routine from completely falling apart, I saw an unfamiliar SUV parked in front of the house. A woman stepped out wearing neutral-colored clothing, a notebook in hand, her eyes quickly scanning the garden. Lauren walked beside her, heels clicking evenly on the stone path, her voice clear and decisive. "The living room walls need repainting. Mom likes this color, but it's too dark. The curtains should be replaced. The light doesn't feel upscale enough. This dining table can stay, but the chairs should be changed." I stood on the front steps, watching them move through the house like two strangers surveying a newly purchased property. No one greeted me. No one asked for my opinion. Lauren glanced at me briefly, offering a thin smile. "I just want everything ready for later, Mom," she said. "You won't be here that long anyway." The words were light, as if she were talking about a short vacation, not about me being erased from the house I had lived in for more than half my life. Evan was no less efficient. The next day, another group arrived. They carried cameras, measuring tools, clipboards. The man in charge introduced himself as an appraiser. Evan shook his hand and talked about interior value, antiques, and the collection Richard had carefully assembled over many years. I watched them open Richard's office door. I heard drawers being pulled open, pens scratching on paper. Evan stood there, pointing things out, explaining, as if the place had belonged to him all along, and I was just a guest who hadn't left yet. I moved from room to room, silently like a shadow. Rooms that had once been filled with memories were now called by different names: main living area, common space, potential layout. They were no longer the places where I read every morning, decorated for Christmas, or hosted the children's birthdays. I began hearing familiar phrases, repeated over and over, wrapped in the tone of concern. "Don't worry, Mom. We'll find you a suitable place. You don't need a house this big anymore. You won't have to worry about upkeep so much." Those words weren't wrong, but they were hollow. They sounded like things people say to soothe a child, not to speak to a woman who had lived her entire adult life in this house. No one asked what I wanted. No one asked if I was ready. That evening, after everyone had left, I locked the doors, went upstairs, and entered my bedroom, the room Richard and I had shared for decades. I sat on the edge of the bed, opened my handbag, and took out the phone. It fit neatly in my hand, silent, lifeless. A small object, yet carrying a strange weight. I pressed the power button again, even though I already knew the result. The screen lit up, the wedding photo, 6 empty circles. I took a deep breath, trying to keep my hand from shaking. I tried the familiar passwords again, not because I believed they would work, but because I needed to be certain I hadn't missed something obvious. The day we bought this house, the day Richard signed his first major contract, the address of the small place we lived when we were newly married. Wrong, wrong, wrong. Each incorrect attempt made the phone vibrate softly, then display a message telling me I had to wait a few minutes before trying again. I stared at the screen, feeling as if someone were watching me, judging, measuring, controlling every move. Richard liked control. Not in a tyrannical way, but in the way of someone who believed that if he didn't keep a tight grip on the wheel, everything would crash. I had grown used to it. I had lived in his orbit for so long that I hadn't realized how much of myself had slowly disappeared. But this was different. He was dead. And yet I was still being controlled. I set the phone down on the nightstand, stood up, and walked into the dressing room. Dresses, suits, coats, all hanging neatly in place, but I knew their days in this room were numbered. I opened a drawer and took out a small wooden box. Inside were a few personal items: the ring I wore when we were first married, some old photographs, and a handwritten letter Richard had written to me many years ago after a fight when he didn't know how to apologize. I picked up the letter and reread it, and for the first time since he died, I felt a slow, simmering anger. Not anger over the will, but anger over the silence. Richard had known what the children would do. He was far too intelligent not to see the change in them, and yet he said nothing to me. He let me walk into this situation, pushed aside, treated like a stranger, without a single warning, or had he spoken, and I simply hadn't listened. The days that followed passed in a haze. Every morning I woke up, went down to the kitchen and made coffee as usual, but the kitchen no longer felt like mine. Lauren had said she would review the design so I didn't dare move anything. Evan had taped notes to several items, marking them keep, sell, appraise. I lived in my own house like a tenant without a lease. Every night I tried unlocking the phone again. I tried new numbers, unfamiliar, combinations. I tried things connected to Richard that only I knew, small, private details that never appeared in files or calendars. Still wrong. The waiting time kept increasing. 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 30 minutes. I began to notice the pattern, and a chill ran down my spine. This was not an ordinary phone. It had been designed to stop me, or anyone, from accessing it too quickly, like a test of patience, or like a door that only opens when the person standing in front of it is truly ready. I didn't know what made me angrier, my children's indifference, or the fact that Richard was still controlling everything from beyond the grave. One afternoon, Lauren walked into the living room while I was reading. She stood there with her arms crossed, her voice awkwardly gentle. "Mom," she said, "Evan and I are looking at a few apartments. There's one that's pretty nice, not too far from here. You'd like it." I looked up at my daughter, at the grown, beautiful, but unfamiliar face. I suddenly realized she wasn't asking whether I wanted to go see it. She was informing me. "We just want you to be comfortable," Lauren added. "You don't really need many things anymore." I nodded. Not because I agreed, but because I didn't want to argue. I was tired of explaining who I was in this house. After Lauren left, I sat alone in the room that had once been the center of our family. I looked around at every object, every wall, every small scratch in the wooden floor whose origin only I knew. And for the first time, a clear, sharp thought formed in my mind. Something was wrong. Not just the children's greed, not just the will, but the entire picture. Too smooth, too perfectly arranged, as if I were just a small variable that needed to be removed for everything to function as planned. I went back to the bedroom and picked up the phone again. It was still silent. But this time, I no longer looked at it with desperation. I looked at it with suspicion, and with a slow, deep anger that was beginning to take shape inside me. In the days that followed, the phone began to reveal its true nature. Not just a locked object, but a system designed to push its holder to the very edge. At first, I thought I simply needed a little more patience. But then I realized the rule. Each time I entered the wrong password, the waiting period increased in a calculated way. Not random, not a technical error. 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 30 minutes, then 1 hour. The screen displayed the same cold message every time, without any change in tone. "Please try again later." I watched the countdown numbers, feeling as if I were standing before a sealed steel door, with someone silently observing on the other side, recording every reaction. I had never believed in psychological games. Richard was the one who liked those. Multi-layered plans, experiments about people and endurance. I had thought he applied them to partners, to markets, not to me. But now, after he was gone, I understood. Perhaps I had always been part of those tests as well. One morning, after the waiting time had increased to 2 hours because of a single wrong attempt, I set the phone down on the table and realized my hands were shaking, not from fear, but from anger. The feeling of being controlled, the thing I had accepted for so many years in my marriage, suddenly became unbearable. I decided I had to look for clues, not on the phone, but in the one place Richard always believed no one would truly touch, his private office in the house. The study was at the end of the second-floor hallway where afternoon light always slanted through a large window. It had once been sacred space to Richard. The children rarely entered unless invited. As for me, I had stepped into it hundreds of times, bringing coffee, carrying files, reminding him to eat dinner, but I had never truly been there. I stood in front of the heavy wooden door, placed my hand on the handle, and hesitated for a second. Something in me still treated this as his territory, even though he was gone. Inside, everything was unchanged. The large desk, stacks of files arranged in an order only Richard understood, bookshelves reaching the ceiling. The smell of old paper, leather from the chair, dried coffee lingering in the air. I moved slowly, afraid of disturbing something fragile. I opened each drawer. First drawer, pens, notebooks, business cards. Second drawer, contracts, financial reports. Third drawer, empty, except for an old metal ruler, something I remembered him using when he was young, before everything became digital. Nothing hinted at a password. I pulled out the chair and sat down. It felt strange sitting in the seat Richard had occupied for decades. It was taller, firmer than the chair I was used to. I placed my hand on the desk, touching the small scratches, marks of time, of nights when he pressed his pen down hard in frustration. Memories flooded in without warning. I saw myself more than 30 years ago, young Audrey, standing at a drafting table, pencil in hand, eyes lighting up as ideas formed. I had been an architect, not famous, but good enough to have my own projects, good enough to be respected. I designed small houses, living spaces with natural light, reading corners, places where children could run and play. Then Richard entered my life with bigger maps, bigger numbers, bigger dreams. Dreams he said were ours. "Just put your work on hold for a while," he'd said. "I need you here. The family needs you." That while lasted more than 40 years. I placed a hand over my chest and took a deep breath, not to accuse, but to admit the truth. I had stepped back willingly. I had let my career fade away, trading it for stability for the family, for Richard, for the children. And I had believed, naively, that it would be acknowledged. I stood up and opened the filing cabinet behind the desk. The heavy drawers slid out slowly. I flipped through folders and binders, searching for a sign, a note, a familiar number, anything that could connect to the phone. Nothing. Disappointment rose, but with it came a clearer realization. Richard never left clues in obvious places. He never did. If the password existed, it wasn't on paper. It was in memory, in emotion, in things only one person could reach. I left the study as dusk settled in. Down the hallway, I heard voices and laughter from the living room. Evan and Lauren were there. I hadn't intended to listen, but their voices carried clearly. "She still hasn't packed, has she?" Evan said, irritation in his voice. "She's probably still hoping that phone will save her." Lauren replied, laughing softly. "It's hard to believe Dad left her that thing." Maybe he felt sorry for her. I stood still, my hand against the wall. Each word landed like a slap that didn't require a hand, not because they were cruel, but because they were unconscious. My children weren't deliberately insulting me. They simply no longer saw me as a person with an inner life, with value. I turned and walked back to my room before they noticed I was there. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed, staring at the dark ceiling, listening to the steady ticking of the clock. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the phone screen with 6 empty circles. I saw the countdown numbers. I saw my own hand entering the wrong code, over and over again. I sat up at 2 a.m. and picked up the phone, even though I knew I still had to wait. I just wanted it in my hands, as if holding it would give me back some sense of control. But I couldn't control anything at all. The nights that followed were the same. I began suffering from chronic insomnia. During the day, I tried to act normal, but my mind was constantly spinning. Every time I heard footsteps in the hallway, I startled, afraid that Evan or Lauren would walk in and remind me of the 30-day deadline like a silent threat. The phone never left me. I carried it with me when I went into the kitchen, when I sat down to read, when I stepped into the garden. It became part of my body, an invisible weight pressing on my chest, on my thoughts. At times, I wondered if I was imagining too much. Maybe Richard had simply left behind a phone, nothing more. Maybe I was assigning meaning to it because I needed something to cling to. But then I remembered Evan's eyes in the conference room. I remembered the words at the funeral. I remembered how everything had been arranged so neatly, so quickly. No, this wasn't random. Richard was not the kind of man who left things to chance. One night, close to dawn, when I woke again from restless sleep, I sat up, picked up the phone, and looked at it for a long time. I didn't enter a password. I didn't touch the screen. I just looked. And for the first time, I didn't feel despair. I saw a game, a psychological game Richard had started, and whether I wanted to or not, I had been pulled into it. He wanted a reaction. He wanted confusion. He wanted anger. The only question was, why? I set the phone down, stood up, and walked to the window. Outside, the sky was beginning to lighten. The palm trees stood silent in the gentle breeze. The house was still asleep. In that dim light, a thought formed slowly but clearly inside me. If this is a game, then I will not quit. And if Richard believed I was strong enough to reach the end, then I will prove him right. The 30th day arrived faster than I expected. That morning I woke very early, even though I had barely slept all night. The pale light of dawn filtered through the bedroom curtains. The room I once thought I would live in until the end of my life. I lay still for a few minutes, listening to the familiar sounds of the house, the soft wind slipping through window cracks, the faint creak of wood under someone's footsteps downstairs. Everything felt the same as always, and that was what made it hurt more. I got up and opened the closet. Most of my belongings had been packed into boxes the day before. Lauren had helped me do it, or rather supervised. She stood with her arms crossed, watching me choose what to keep, occasionally offering gentle reminders. "You don't need to take that, Mom. You can leave this one. The new place is small." The new place. A phrase that felt hollow. I took only what was truly necessary. A few simple outfits, some old books, the wooden box of photos, and the phone. The locked phone stayed in my handbag just as it had for weeks. I no longer tried to unlock it every night. The waiting time had grown absurd. I kept it with me only as a reminder that my life did not end here, even if everything around me was trying to prove otherwise. Evan wasn't there that morning. He had gone on a business trip, or at least that was what he said. Lauren walked me to the door. She hugged me quickly, lightly, as if holding on too long might become inconvenient. "Call if you need anything," she said, her voice just gentle enough not to sound cold. "I'm fine," I replied. I stepped outside and stood on the stone steps for one more second. I turned back and looked at the house. the white columns, the garden where I had tended every flower bed, every shrub. 40 years of memories fit perfectly into a single frame, and I had been erased from it in 1 month. No one stood beside me then. The car that took me away, an old sedan Evan had arranged, rolled slowly out of the gate. I didn't look back again. I knew that if I did, I wouldn't be strong enough to go on. The new apartment was less than a 20-minute drive from the mansion, but it felt like another world. The building was old, its gray paint peeling in places. The hallway was narrow, lit by dim yellow lights, smelling of dampness mixed with old food. The elevator creaked as it climbed to the 3rd floor. My apartment had one. Small bedroom, a living room so narrow it barely fit an old sofa and a coffee table. The kitchen was a corner space with a 2-burner electric stove and an old refrigerator that hummed steadily. The window looked out onto the parking lot behind the building, where neon lights reflected off cracked concrete. I stood in the middle of the empty room, suitcase at my feet, and wondered, how did I end up here? Lauren said this place was just enough. I didn't argue. I no longer had the strength to. I set the suitcase down, opened it, and hung a few clothes on the flimsy metal rack. Everything moved slowly, as if my body were trying to adjust to a new rhythm my mind hadn't yet accepted. The allowance Evan promised arrived at the end of the first week, $600. When the bank notification appeared on the ATM screen, I stood there for a long moment. $600 to cover rent, utilities, food, medication. I did the math quickly, a habit from the early days of my marriage to Richard when every dollar mattered. The numbers didn't add up. I started cutting back. First, the medication. I had blood pressure pills I was supposed to take daily. I decided to take them every other day, then once every 2 days. I told myself, I'm fine, it's temporary. Food became simpler too. Bread, canned soup, instant noodles. I ate less. Not because I wasn't hungry, but because I was afraid I would need that money more tomorrow than today. Evenings in the new apartment were quiet in an unpleasant way. There was no rustling wind in the garden, no large clock ticking in the living room, only the sound of cars in the parking lot, a television from the neighboring unit, and the old refrigerator, humming like an artificial heartbeat. I called Evan in the 2nd week. The phone rang for a long time before going to voicemail. I didn't leave a message. I called Lauren. It rang 5 times, then stopped. I sent a short text. I just wanted to check in. The message was marked as read, but there was no reply. I sat on the old sofa, the phone on the table, watching the screen fade to black. The feeling of abandonment didn't arrive all at once. It came slowly, drop by drop, like water leaking through tiny cracks until everything was flooded. In the 3rd week, the allowance dropped to $400. No explanation, just a new number appearing in my account. I stood at the ATM, receipt in hand, feeling a wave of lightheadedness. I leaned against the wall, took a deep breath, and waited for it to pass. The landlord, a middle-aged man with a protruding belly and a dry voice, began knocking more often. The first time, he reminded me politely. The second time, his tone grew firmer. By the 3rd time, he stood in front of the door with his hands on his hips. "You're late on the rent," he said. "I know," I replied. "I'm waiting for my children to send the money." "I don't care where it comes from," he said. "I just need it in full and on time." When the door closed, I slid down to the floor, my back against the thin wooden door. I closed my eyes, forcing myself not to cry. I didn't want to cry in this apartment. I didn't want this place to witness my collapse. The nights that followed, I slept very little. When I did sleep, I dreamed I was standing in the old mansion, but every door was locked. I held the phone and entered the password, but the numbers dissolved beneath my fingers. I woke up in the dark, heart racing, cold sweat soaking my back. I stopped calling Evan and Lauren, not because I didn't need them, but because I understood. Those calls led nowhere. They only made me feel smaller, weaker. One afternoon, as I counted the remaining money in my wallet, I realized I had hit bottom. Not because I was running out of cash, but because I had started considering things I had never thought about before. Selling my wedding ring, selling sentimental items, even looking for work at my age. I looked at myself in the bathroom mirror. My face was thinner, my skin duller, my eyes tired. I didn't recognize the woman staring back. That woman was no longer Richard White's wife, no longer the lady of a grand mansion. She was just a tenant trying to survive. That evening, as I sat on the floor with my back against the sofa, the phone in my handbag brushed against my hand. I took it out and placed it on my palm. It was still cold, still silent, still locked. I let out a quiet laugh, a dry laugh, neither happy nor sad. "If this is the lowest point," I whispered, unsure who I was speaking to, "then I'm already here." And in that moment, I understood. There was nothing left to lose. I was in free fall. But sometimes it's only when you hit bottom that you begin to realize you still have the ability to rise. 30 days. That number appeared on the phone screen on a drizzly evening when I entered the wrong password one more time, for the last time. There was no gentle vibration, no familiar countdown notification, just a short, cold, absolute line of text. Device locked for 30 days. I stared at those words for a long time, long enough for the rain outside the window to change rhythm, from light tapping to a steady pour. 30 days, exactly the same amount of time I had once been granted in the mansion. I let out a brief, hollow laugh, then went silent. Not because it was funny, but because I realized I had been cornered into a very narrow space, where there was no room left for vague hope. I set the phone down on the table and turned it face down, as if doing so might lessen its presence. But it was still there, in the room, in my head, in every breath I took. The days that followed passed slowly, sticking together like wet pages. I no longer tried to unlock it. I no longer counted the hours. I knew that no matter what I did, the phone would not respond. And that feeling of absolute rejection, not from a person, but from an inanimate object, exhausted me in a different way. The money in my account dwindled faster than I had expected. I began looking around my small apartment with new eyes, the eyes of someone considering selling off pieces of her life. The first item I placed on the table was a wedding ring. Not the one I had worn for decades. I didn't have the courage for that, but an older, thinner ring I had worn when I was young. I took it to a second-hand shop near the bus station. The man behind the counter examined it with a magnifying glass, turned it over a few times, then named a price. I nodded. I didn't bargain. Next came a few pieces of jewelry, then an old watch, then some rare books I had kept because I thought, I'll reread these someday. Each time I left the shop, it felt as though I had cut away a very small piece of myself. Not enough to cause sharp pain, but enough to leave emptiness. I didn't tell my children. I didn't call. I didn't text. Not because I didn't want them to know, but because I wanted to see whether in the silence they would notice my absence. They didn't. By the 4th week, I had no choice but to call Evan, not to complain, just to ask about the overdue rent. The phone rang longer than ever before. Then voicemail answered, polite and distant. I left a short, neutral message without blame. There was no response. I called Lauren. This time she picked up. Her voice sounded busy. "What is it, Mom?" I just wanted to ask about this month's money." "Oh, that," Lauren interrupted, her tone softening slightly. "I think you should start figuring things out on your own. We can't support you forever." I held the phone, saying nothing. "I understand," I said at last. "Okay," Lauren replied quickly. "I'm in a meeting." The call ended. I sat still, watching the screen fade to black. There was no burst of anger, no tears, just a cold confirmation. They had fully withdrawn their hands from me. My birthday fell in the middle of that time. I woke up that day like any other. No flowers, no card, no phone call. I made myself a weak cup of coffee and sat by the window watching rain fall on the parking lot. I remembered past birthdays. Richard usually gave me a small, understated gift, a book, a pen, a quiet dinner. This year, there was nothing. I didn't celebrate. I didn't remind anyone. I went out and bought a small cake from a nearby shop. I ate it alone, cutting it into 2 pieces out of old habit, then realizing I only needed one. I put the other piece in the refrigerator, not knowing why. That evening, I sat on the living room floor with my back against the sofa, the phone placed in front of me, locked, silent, like a door that had decided not to open. I closed my eyes. "Are you satisfied now?" I whispered, unsure who I was talking to. If this is a lesson, then I've learned enough. I didn't believe Richard could hear me, but I kept speaking, because there was no one else. "I did everything right, Richard. I stayed. I sacrificed. I trusted you. And now I'm here, alone, without a home, without money, without children." My throat tightened. I took a deep breath, trying to keep my voice from breaking. "If that phone is what you left for me, then why did you lock it like this?" There was no answer, only the sound of rain outside the window. In the days after my birthday, my body began to react. Sudden dizziness, mornings when I had to sit for a long time before standing up. I knew I couldn't keep cutting my medication like this, but I also didn't know where the money would come from. The landlord came back, this time without knocking. He waited for me in the hallway, arms crossed. "If you don't pay by this week," he said, "I'll send a formal notice." I nodded. I didn't argue. I didn't beg. I had already used up all those words. That night, I sat on the bed for a long time, staring at the locked phone on the nightstand. I didn't touch it. I just looked. And for the first time, a very dangerous thought appeared. Should I give up? Not giving up in a dramatic sense, but letting go. Accepting that some doors are not meant for me. Accepting that 40 years of living for others have led me to an ending like this. I lay down and turned my face toward the wall. Tears came, but not violently. They were quiet, warm, soaking into the pillow. I didn't try to wipe them away. And then, when I thought I had hit bottom, when everything inside me settled into something close to emptiness, something very small happened. Not on the phone, not from my children, but from me. I suddenly realized that over these past weeks, I had been fighting, not to unlock the phone, but to prove that I deserved to unlock it. I had tried to remember, to guess, to struggle, as if I needed to pass some kind of test in order to be allowed to keep living. That thought made me sit up straight. "No," I said softly, for the first time with a strange certainty. "If this is your game, then I'm not playing by the old rules anymore." I didn't know what that meant. I had no plan, no money, no guarantees, but in that moment, in the middle of the small apartment, in the middle of despair, I felt a very subtle shift, like the air before a heavy storm suddenly thickening. I picked up the phone, not to unlock it, just to hold it. And for the first time in weeks, I didn't beg it. I simply whispered, not like a plea, but like a very quiet challenge. If you still have something to say, then it's time. Outside, the rain stopped. Inside me, something, very slowly, very deeply, began to turn. I don't know why I picked up the phone at that moment. There was no warning sign, no clear thought, just a very light impulse, like when your hand reaches out to catch something that's about to fall before your brain has time to give the command. I sat on the edge of the bed, the room so silent that I could hear the faint metallic sound as my fingernail brushed against the edge of the device. The screen was still black. I pressed the power button. The light came on slowly, unhurried, as if it, too, were deciding whether it should respond to me. The logo appeared, then disappeared. The old photo showed up, the photo of Richard and me taken many years ago on an autumn afternoon. I was younger, my hair longer. He was standing slightly angled toward me, his hand resting on the back of the chair. I had looked at this photo dozens of times over the past weeks. It no longer hurt the way it once had. It was just a memory, frozen in place. The familiar words appeared. Enter passcode. 6 empty circles. I didn't think. I didn't review the numbers I had already tried. I didn't repeat dates, milestones, painful or happy memories. I didn't try to remember. I just let my hand move. My thumb touched the screen, pressed the first number, then the second. A slow, steady rhythm without hesitation. I wasn't counting. I wasn't looking. I was simply following something very deep, very vague, like a memory that didn't live in my head, but in my body. When I pressed the final number, I still didn't look up. Then, very softly, a sound appeared. Not the error tone, not the familiar gentle vibration of rejection, but a small click, almost impossible to hear, like an old lock finally deciding to turn. I lifted my head. The circles lit up. The screen flickered once, and then it opened. For a second, I didn't understand what was happening. I just stared at the screen, my mind empty, my heart pounding so hard I had to place a hand on my chest. I had grown so used to failure that when the opposite happened, my brain couldn't process it in time. It opened. The phone, the thing that had been silent, sealed, cold for weeks, was open in front of me, calmly, without fanfare, as if it had simply been waiting for this exact moment. I didn't touch the screen right away. I was afraid that if I did, it would disappear. I was afraid this was just a glitch, a brief mistake. I breathed slowly until my heartbeat settled, then finally placed my finger on the glass. The home screen appeared. It didn't look like any phone I had ever used. No social media, no news, no entertainment apps. Just a few simple icons arranged neatly. And right in the center, more prominent than all the others, was a folder. The folder was named Audrey. I froze. Not my files, not documents, not some generic label, but my name, my full name. No abbreviation, no explanation. I raised my hand to my mouth, not out of shock, but because of a strange feeling, like someone had just spoken my name out loud in an empty room. I tapped the folder. It opened almost instantly, without delay. Inside was a long list of files. They were numbered neatly from top to bottom. No poetic titles, no explanations, just plain text. File 01, File 02, File 03. I tapped the first file. The screen turned white. A document appeared, clear and sharp. I read the first line and felt the air in the room thicken. Property Ownership Certificate. Owner's name, Audrey White. I blinked, read it again, and again. It wasn't a mistake. It wasn't a similar name. It was me. The property address was in San Diego, a 4-story commercial building in the downtown area. Estimated value, more than $3 million. I sat completely still. My hands began to shake. Not the kind of shaking from cold, but the kind that comes when your brain is struggling to catch up with what your eyes have just seen. I scrolled down. The signature at the bottom, the notarization, the date. Everything was legal, complete, no room for doubt. I backed out and opened the second file. Another property. This one was an apartment complex in Portland. More than 20 units. Owner's name, Audrey White. Value, nearly $3 million. The third file. An industrial warehouse in Nevada. The fourth file. A commercial plot of land in Arizona. I opened file after file, like someone flipping through a book they didn't realize they had been writing all along. Every page was a direct blow to my old understanding of my own life. Every property was in my name, not joint ownership, not authorization, full ownership. I don't remember how many files I opened. I only know that at some point, my hands were no longer steady enough to hold the phone. I set it down on the bed, then picked it up again, afraid that if I looked away for too long, everything would vanish. I started adding the numbers in my head. 3 million, 2.8 million, 1.4 million, 4.5 million. The numbers stacked on top of each other, crossing 10 million, then 20, then 30. I stopped when I realized I was no longer clear-headed enough to continue. More than $40 million. Not on paper promises, not future possibilities, but real assets, real properties, things that still existed out there, still generating income, still standing firm. While I had been sitting in this small apartment, eating dry bread and counting every dollar, I leaned back, my spine against the headboard. The ceiling slowly spun above me. I closed my eyes, not to avoid seeing, but to feel. Richard had done this, not in 1 year, not in 2, but over many years. Some of the properties had been purchased 8 or 9 years earlier. There were notes about rental income, cash flow, regular deposits. Everything had been recorded carefully, quietly, without display, like an underground current existing alongside the life I thought I knew. I opened the phone again and scrolled further down. A summary table appeared, income being transferred regularly into a bank account. Account holder's name, Audrey White. I had never opened that account, but the signatures, the paperwork, everything was mine. I laughed, not a joyful laugh, but a laugh released from overwhelming shock. I pressed a hand to my forehead, feeling a dull ache behind my eyes. I took a deep breath, trying to stay conscious. "You," I whispered, my voice rough. "What did you do, Richard?" The pieces began to fall into place, slowly but firmly. His coldness in the final years, the way he avoided questions when I asked about finances, how he always said, "You don't need to worry." I had thought it was control, patriarchy, the habit of a man who didn't want to share power. I was wrong, or at least I had only seen half the truth. Richard had been preparing for a long time, not for the children, but for me. Not in the way I expected, not with words or a clear will, but with a silent plan, patient, cruel enough to force me to hit bottom before I could stand up. I didn't know whether to be angry with him or grateful to him, probably both. I picked up the phone again, this time my hands no longer shaking as before. I swiped the screen and looked again at the folder bearing my name. It wasn't a gift. It was a return of something I had lost long ago, the right to have my name on my own life. Outside the window, the parking lot was still wet from the earlier rain. The neon lights still reflected on cracked concrete. Nothing outside had changed, but inside me, something had shifted. I was no longer the woman who had been pushed out of her home, living on a trickle of allowance, begging for unanswered calls. I was still in this apartment, still wearing old clothes, still unable to afford a proper meal. But I knew, and knowing alone was enough for the world to begin turning in a different direction. I sat for a long time in front of the open screen, pale blue light reflecting off the low ceiling of the apartment. The numbers, the text, the documents were still there, but I didn't open any more files. I knew I wasn't ready yet. The dizziness hadn't fully passed, as if I had just stepped out of a dark room and my eyes hadn't adjusted to the light. In the lower corner of the screen, there was an icon I hadn't touched yet. A small, simple icon, not as prominent as the folder with my name, a voice recording app. I knew what it was even before opening it. My finger hovered in the air. I realized I was hesitating in a way that felt very familiar. Just like the times I stood outside Richard's office, hand on the doorknob but not turning it, afraid of what waited on the other side. I took a deep breath, then touched the screen. The list was short, only one recording. The file name wasn't elaborate. No date, no note, just a simple line, like his voice when he no longer wanted to explain things to anyone. For Audrey. I closed my eyes for a second. When I opened them, my finger was already resting on the play button. There was a brief moment of silence, then a soft breath. A faint rustling sound like someone adjusting a chair, and then his voice came through. Not the voice he used in meetings, not the hard, steady tone he used with partners, but Richard's voice when it was just the two of us, when he was tired, when he didn't need to pretend to be strong. Audrey. Just hearing my name once like that made me bite my lip to keep from crying. I hadn't heard him say my name that way in a very long time. If you're listening to this, he continued slowly, then it means I'm no longer there to say this to you in person. I set the phone down on the bed, but kept my hand on it, as if afraid the voice would disappear if I let go. I imagine you're very angry right now, he said. Maybe you think I'm cruel. Maybe you think I betrayed you in some way. He paused, his breathing heavier. You have every right to think that. I let out a silent laugh, a faint, bitter curve of the lips. Angry? I had already passed that stage. What I felt now wasn't sharp. It was deep and heavy, like a stone pressing against my chest. I'm sorry, Richard said without detouring this time. I'm sorry I let you suffer. I'm sorry I didn't tell you beforehand. I'm sorry I made you feel abandoned. I closed my eyes. His words fell slowly, not rushed, as if each sentence had been carefully chosen. I know these past months would be hell for you, he said. I know the children would treat you coldly. I know you would have to leave the house you considered your life. I know you would begin to doubt yourself. I opened my eyes and stared at the ceiling. He knew. He had known, and he let it happen anyway. I didn't do this to punish you, his voice lowered. I did this because I believed that without that fall, you would never truly see. I shook my head slightly, as if he could see me. See what clearly? I had already seen more than enough. I've watched our children for many years, Richard continued. I kept convincing myself they just needed time, that they would mature, that they would learn gratitude. He let out a very soft laugh, short and tired. I was wrong, and that was my greatest mistake. His voice dropped even lower, carrying an admission I had never heard from him when he was alive. I taught them how to make money, he said, but I never taught them how to value people, especially you. I felt my throat tighten. I wanted to argue, to say that he shared responsibility for that he had let me step back for far too long. But I stayed silent. I let him speak. "I know that if I had told you about those assets while I was still alive," he continued, "I know exactly what you would have done." He didn't need to say more. I knew. I had always known. I would have suggested sharing them with the children. I would have worried. I would have questioned whether I deserved them. I would have once again put other people's needs first. "I couldn't let that happen," Richard said, "not because I didn't trust you, but because I trusted you too much." I laughed, this time out loud, a small, fractured sound. "I needed you to see them with nothing left to hide," he said. "I needed you to see who Evan and Lauren truly are, not through the role of a self-sacrificing mother, but with your own eyes." He paused. The silence stretched longer. When he spoke again, his voice was slow and firm. "That phone was not a joke, Audrey. It wasn't a memory test. It was a door." I held my breath. "The passcode isn't in dates," he said. "It's not in numbers anyone could guess. It's in the place you abandoned a long time ago." I remembered the moment my hand had moved on its own, without thought. A memory not stored in my head, but in my body. I understood. "The day that phone opens," he continued, "won't be the day you become rich. It will be the day you become free." His voice softened, the way it used to late at night, when the world outside had gone to sleep. "I set that timing to coincide with your 70th birthday," he said, "not because of the number, but because I wanted you to step into the next part of your life as yourself." 70 years old. I looked down at my hands, the wrinkles, the age spots. I had thought 70 was the end, a period, a closing chapter. Richard had thought differently. "I know you'll be angry," he said, his voice heavier, "and you have every right to be. I accept that, but I hope that when the anger fades, you'll understand that I did this because I believed in you more than anyone." I raised my hand to cover my mouth. Tears fell, not in a rush, but quietly, like water finally finding a way out. "That phone," he said, "is not something I left for you." I shook my head slightly. "It's something I returned to you." His breathing sounded one last time, then the recording ended. The screen fell silent. My small room sank into stillness, broken only by distant cars in the parking lot. I sat there for a long time. I didn't replay the recording. I didn't open any more files. I let his words settle, little by little, like sediment sinking in a glass of water after being stirred too hard. I was angry, and I understood. Angry that he had let me go hungry, humiliated, alone. Angry that he had decided for me once again, even if his intentions were good. But I was also awake now. I had seen my children clearly, more clearly than ever before. And without those months, I might have gone on deceiving myself. I picked up the phone and placed it neatly on the table. I didn't call anyone. I didn't announce anything. I didn't ask for advice. I didn't tell Evan. I didn't tell Lauren. I didn't even call a lawyer. I chose silence, not out of fear, but because for the first time in my life, I understood that silence could be an active choice, not submission. I didn't need them to know what I now knew. Not yet. I stood up and opened the window. Cool night air flowed in. I took a deep breath and felt my chest open. Somewhere inside me, something had ended, and something else, very slowly, very steadily, was beginning. I remained by the window long after the recording ended, not because I needed more air, but because I needed time to accept that what I had just heard was real. Richard was gone, but he hadn't vanished. He had only changed the way he existed. from a man of flesh and bone into a chain of carefully calculated decisions, revealing themselves layer by layer. When I returned to the table, the phone was still there, quiet, as if it had never kept me awake night after night. The screen was dark, but I knew that inside it an entire world was waiting for me to step in. I touched it lightly to wake it again, not out of curiosity, but because something Richard had said wouldn't let go of me. You are never alone. If not the children, then who? I opened the contacts. The list was so short it made me freeze. Not 10 numbers, not 5, just one name, Thomas Reed. No photo, no notes, just a name and a phone number with a familiar California area code. I repeated the name in my mind, and old memories began to stir. Thomas Reed, Richard's close friend, a man I had met only a few times at polite, obligatory dinners, quiet, always impeccably dressed, never flashy, a lawyer, but without the coldness I had seen in others in that world. Thomas always kept his distance, courteous, but his eyes were constantly observing, like he saw things others overlooked. Richard rarely spoke about him. Only one sentence repeated whenever I asked about complicated legal decisions. Thomas is the man I trust most. I stared at the number for a long time. Call or don't call? Part of me wanted to remain silent, to keep this secret to myself just a little longer, like a small flame newly lit. I was afraid that opening the door too soon would let the wind blow it out. But another part of me, the part learning to stand upright again, understood that I couldn't do everything alone. Not now. I pressed call. The ringing sounded steady, unhurried. I counted in my head. 1, 2, 3. I almost thought no one would answer. Then, on the 4th ring, a deep, warm male voice came through. Audrey. Not hello, not who's calling, but my name, spoken as if he had been waiting for this call for a very long time. I swallowed. You are Thomas Reed? Yes, he said. I've been waiting for you. Not waiting. Waiting. Those words are different, and Thomas knew that. I'm not sure where to begin, I said. You don't need to, he replied. Richard told me this call would come at the right time. I closed my eyes. You know everything? I know what I need to know, Thomas said calmly, and I know what you've been through. I didn't explain. I didn't complain. There was no need. He didn't ask, and I didn't want to speak. There was a strange, shared understanding in that conversation, as if any explanation would be redundant. The assets on the phone, they're all real? I asked, even though I already knew the answer. Completely real, Thomas replied without hesitation. All documents are legal, notarized, carefully managed, and most importantly, everything is in your name. I took a deep breath. And the cash flow? Still running, he said, for many years now. I leaned back in my chair. The small apartment suddenly felt so quiet I could hear my own heartbeat. How much? I asked, my voice softer. Thomas paused briefly, as if choosing his words carefully so I wouldn't be overwhelmed. In addition to the property value, he said slowly, you currently have a little over $6 million in cash across linked accounts. That amount comes from rental income, conservative investments, and reinvested profits over many years. I said nothing. Not because I didn't believe him, but because my body needed a few seconds to understand that I was no longer living day to day in survival mode. Richard was very careful, Thomas continued. He didn't allow anyone, not even the children, to access this information. Why did he trust you so much? I asked. Thomas gave a very small smile, not a happy one. Because I was the only person who ever told him that. If he didn't change, he would lose you. That sentence stunned me. Richard wasn't someone who took advice easily, Thomas went on, but he listened to me on that point, even if it was late. I looked around my apartment, the place where the landlord had knocked so many times demanding rent. I'm about to be evicted, I said, allowing my voice to weaken for the first time in the call. I know, Thomas said, and that won't happen. I held my breath. Right after you hang up, he continued, I'll transfer enough to cover all outstanding rent, plus the next 3 months. Your landlord will receive the money within 24 hours. You don't have to, I began. This isn't help, Thomas interrupted gently. This is your right. I'm just the one carrying it out. I closed my eyes. The pressure in my chest, the weight that had sat there for weeks, suddenly eased. But there is one thing, Thomas said. Richard was very clear about this. I opened my eyes. What is it? You can't act publicly, he said. Not yet. You don't tell the children. You don't tell the family lawyer. You don't tell anyone except me. I understood immediately. Until my birthday, I said. That's right, Thomas replied. He wanted everything to happen at the right time. I let out a small smile. That was always him. Thomas was silent for a moment. And he wanted you to have time to prepare, he said, not with paperwork, but with yourself. After the call ended, I sat still for a long time, not because I was overwhelmed, but because I was feeling a very slow, very deep shift, not explosive joy, but steadiness returning, something I had lost far longer ago than I realized. I began to prepare, quietly. No luxury shopping, no moving. I simply started caring for the basic things I had neglected. I took my medication regularly again. I ate full meals. I walked every morning around the neighborhood, letting the early sunlight touch my skin. I bought a few new outfits, not expensive, but well-fitting, neat. I looked at myself in the mirror a little longer, not to find flaws, but to become reacquainted with myself. With each passing day, I felt my back straighten, my steps grow steadier, my eyes no longer avoided other people's gazes. I still lived in that apartment. I still walked through the narrow hallway, still greeted the elderly neighbor next door. No one knew what had changed, and I liked it that way. The secret was no longer a burden. It became a support, and for the first time in many years, I was no longer waiting for anyone to define my worth. I was preparing, not for revenge, not for display, but to step into the next part of my life as myself, Audrey White, the keeper of the secret. Big changes sometimes don't arrive with explosions, but with quiet tremors spreading beneath surfaces that seem solid. I realized that one ordinary morning while making coffee in the small kitchen, the phone vibrated on the table. Not a message from Thomas, not a bank notification, but an incoming call from Evan's number. I stared at the screen for a long time. When was the last time Evan had called me? I searched my memory and realized I could no longer remember clearly. During the months I struggled, the calls had always been from me and rarely answered. And now, my eldest son's name appeared, like a wrong note in a familiar melody. I didn't answer right away. I let the phone ring for a few more beats, not out of spite, but to listen to myself. I wanted to know what I was feeling, not anger, not anticipation, just clarity. When I finally picked up, Evan's voice came through almost immediately, fast and urgent. "Mom, are you okay?" A very simple question, but the way he asked it wasn't simple at all. His voice no longer carried its usual sharpness, no longer rushed toward an ending. There was a clear tension in it, as if he were trying to stay calm while something inside him was already cracking. I'm fine, I said briefly. There was a pause. Evan cleared his throat. Mom, where are you right now? At home, I said. I didn't say apartment. I didn't say rental. I just said home. And I knew Evan would interpret that however he wanted. Oh, that's good, Evan said quickly. I wanted to check on you. I didn't reply. I let the silence do its work. I had learned that sometimes silence makes people reveal more than any question ever could. Mom, Evan continued, lowering his voice, the company has been having some trouble lately. I watched, the steam rise from my coffee cup and dissolve into the air. Is that so? I asked evenly. Yeah, Evan exhaled. Some older projects. Ran into issues. A few loans came due that we didn't expect. I didn't sound surprised. Not because I already knew, though I did, but because I understood this wasn't the moment to react. Lauren's been really stressed too, Evan added, as if layering weight onto the story. She hasn't slept much these past few nights. Is that right? I said. Evan went quiet again. I imagined him standing in Richard's old, spacious office, phone in hand, staring at some blank patch of wall where awards and framed photos used to hang with pride. Mom, Evan said, slower this time, we thought, maybe you should know what's going on. I smiled very slightly. No. A word that sounded considerate, but beneath it lay a very familiar probing. What do you think I could help with? I asked. Evan hesitated. Just a brief moment, but enough for me to hear the panic slipping through the cracks of his carefully controlled voice. I mean, you were Dad's wife, Evan said. Maybe there are things Dad left behind that we don't fully understand. I set my coffee down. The will was read, I said. You remember that, don't you? I do, Evan replied quickly. But the lawyer said there are still some complex clauses, financial structures. Dad was always very discreet. I didn't answer right away. In my mind, Richard's voice echoed from the recording. I needed you to see them with nothing left to hide, and here it was. Did you call to check on me? I asked calmly, or to ask about money? Evan inhaled sharply. Mom, it's okay, I interrupted, still composed. I just want to know what we're talking about. On the other end of the line, Evan said nothing for a few seconds. Then his voice changed completely. No more circling. The company is in danger, Evan said. The debt is bigger than we thought. If we don't fix this in time, we could lose everything. I closed my eyes briefly, not out of heartbreak, but because I could now see with absolute clarity the picture Richard had drawn long before. And you think I have the answers, I said. I think you might have information, Evan replied. Dad trusted you. A very good line, and a very late one. The call ended shortly after. Evan didn't ask outright. He kept a polite distance, as if he didn't dare cross the final line yet. But I knew. The door had opened. No one had pushed it fully, but it was no longer closed. That afternoon, Lauren called. Unlike Evan, her voice was softer, almost pleading. Mom, she said, stretching the word the way she used to. How have you been? Are you eating properly? I leaned back in my chair. Pretended concern. Richard had been right. When money becomes a problem, concern returns very quickly. I'm fine, I said. Thank you. I know. We haven't been around much, Lauren said, her voice trembling slightly. But everything happened so fast. We were under a lot of pressure, too. Pressure because of money, I said, not as an accusation, but as a statement. Lauren fell silent. Then she sighed. Mom, the company is In really bad shape. I didn't respond. Do you remember Dad ever mentioning private investment funds? Lauren asked, or accounts he didn't put under the corporation? I looked out the window. The sunlight that day was pale, neither harsh nor sad. An ordinary day, something I hadn't had in months. I don't remember, I said, and it was true in a very precise way. I didn't remember. I knew. Lauren went on for a while longer, more than Evan, more emotional, but the substance was the same. Panic wrapped in gentle words, fear hidden behind the word family. When the call ended, I didn't feel relieved. I didn't feel burdened. I just felt clear, clearer than ever. The corporation Richard left behind, the thing my children had proudly taken over like a trophy, was beginning to reveal its true face. Old loans, over-budget projects, financial commitments built on the assumption that everything would keep expanding forever. Richard had left them a large ship, but he had also left it with a hull full of cracks. And now, as water began to pour in, Evan and Lauren panicked and turned back to look for the person they had abandoned on shore. I sat there in my small apartment, listening to the ticking of the wall clock. Each passing second was a tiny shift in the balance of power. I didn't call back. I didn't text. I didn't promise anything. I didn't act distant either. I simply observed. I observed the way my children's voices trembled when they mentioned money, the speed with which they remembered me once things began to fall apart, the way, "How are you, Mom?" was followed almost immediately by, "Do you remember what Dad said?" And in that observation, I fully understood the lesson Richard had wanted to teach, not to punish our children, but to let me see myself and my true place in this story. I didn't reveal the secret, not because I feared losing leverage, but because I knew that when truth is spoken too early, it loses its weight. The balance had shifted, and this time I didn't need to do anything at all. I only needed to stand firm. That morning, I woke up before the alarm went off, not because I was anxious, but because my body had grown used to waking early over the past weeks. Light slipped through the curtains, soft and clear, without the heaviness that used to accompany mornings. I got up, made tea, and drank it slowly, letting the warmth spread through my throat. Today was my birthday. 70 years old. I put on the dark blue dress I had chosen a few days earlier. Not elaborate, not showy, but fitting in a way that surprised me. I looked at myself in the mirror longer than usual, not to search for signs of age, but to recognize something that had changed in my eyes. They no longer avoided. They were steady, direct, and clear. Thomas Reed's office was in an old building downtown, not flashy like the glass towers where Richard used to work, but solid and quiet. When I stepped inside, the scent of old wood and paper reminded me of libraries from long ago, places people went to find truth, not to display power. Thomas stood when I entered. He smiled, subtle and restrained. "Happy birthday, Audrey," he said. "Thank you," I replied. My voice sounded calm, as if today were just another ordinary day. But I knew beneath that calm, something was surging. Evan and Lauren were already there. Both sat on the opposite side of the long table next to the family lawyer. Evan looked more worn than the last time I'd seen him. Tie loosened, dark circles under his eyes. Lauren maintained her usual polished appearance, but her hands on the table kept tightening and releasing, an uncontrollable habit. When I sat down, no one spoke. I noticed my children's gazes had changed. The quiet contempt was gone, but it wasn't respect yet either. It was caution, the kind that appears when people are no longer sure they hold the advantage. Thomas opened his briefcase. "Let's begin," he said evenly. Today, according to Richard White's instructions, the remaining asset structure will be fully disclosed. Evan leaned forward. Lauren held her breath. For many years, Thomas continued, Richard White built two parallel systems of assets, one public, the corporation you are currently managing, and one independent, privately managed. He slid the first folder toward me. All properties listed here, commercial buildings, rental apartment complexes, industrial warehouses, are owned by Audrey White. Lauren let out a very small sound. Evan froze, his eyes locked on the pages. Thomas went on. The current estimated value of this real estate portfolio is over $40 million. The air in the room thickened. I didn't look at my children. I looked at the edge of the table where light reflected in a thin, straight line. I focused on my breathing, steady, unhurried. Thomas placed a second folder down. In addition, linked accounts, including accumulated cash from rental income and conservative investments, currently total over $6 million. Evan swallowed hard. Lauren raised a hand to cover her mouth, then lowered it, as if afraid of appearing weak. And this, Thomas said calmly, is the final part. He opened the thickest folder. An independent investment structure established many years ago. Current estimated value, approximately $68 million. Sole owner, Audrey White. There was no sigh, no protest, only a heavy silence dropping straight onto the table. Altogether, Thomas concluded, the total value of the assets under Audrey White's name exceeds $110 million, with no associated debt. Lauren shook her head slowly. No, that can't be, she said, her voice breaking. Dad never told us anything. Thomas looked straight ahead. He told me. Evan turned toward me. For the first time, I saw not just fear in my son's eyes, but a very naked question. Mom, Evan said, how long have you known about this? Since I needed to know, I replied. Then, you'll help us, right? Evan said quickly, as if afraid I might have time to think. The company is on the edge, just a small part. I raised my hand, not high, not forcefully. Evan stopped. Before we talk about money, I said, my voice sounding clearer than I expected, I want to talk about something else. I looked at each of my children in turn. Over the past months when I had nothing in my hands, how did you treat me? Lauren lowered her head. Evan stayed silent. I'm not saying this to accuse, I continued. I'm saying it so we can look at it honestly. I was forced out of my home. My allowance was cut. My calls went unanswered. And today, when you call me family, what is it for? Because you're our mother, Lauren said, her voice trembling. No, I said softly, because you're afraid. The words weren't sharp, but they were deep enough to cut. Evan stood up abruptly. Mom, Dad didn't want things to turn out this way. Your father did want this, I interrupted, my tone still calm, and now it's my turn to want something. I stood up, not to leave, but to finish speaking. I spent my whole life believing that sacrifice was love, that silence was connection. Today, I end that illusion. Lauren broke down, crying. Evan gripped the edge of the table. I will not save the corporation, I said, not out of revenge, but because if I do, this lesson will lose its meaning. Then, what do you want us to do? Evan asked hoarsely. Stand up, I replied, on your own 2 feet. I looked at Thomas, then at the family lawyer. All necessary procedures have already been prepared, I said. From here on, my assets will be managed the way I choose. I turned back to my children. If one day you come to me not for money, but for respect, we can talk. But today, This conversation ends here. No one stopped me as I walked out. No one called after me. The hallway was long, light slanting in through tall windows. I walked slowly but steadily. Outside, the city was as noisy as ever. I took a deep breath, feeling the cool air fill my lungs. There were no fireworks, no applause. But inside me, there was a calm I had never known before. 70 years old, I walked out not as someone who had been forgiven, but as someone who had chosen her own path. And this time, I did not look back. I didn't return to that small apartment for long. Not because I was ashamed of the months I had lived there, but because I understood this. Some places exist only to teach us a lesson, then quietly close when their purpose is fulfilled. I left on a pale, sunny morning, carrying very little with me. No large suitcase, no sense of escape, just a natural transition, like leaving a room you've stayed in too long to open a door into a different space. The first thing I did wasn't to buy a new house or travel, as many people might imagine. I reopened my architecture studio. The office was on the second floor of an old building, near a small park where older people often sat reading newspapers at noon. The sign was simple, just my name. No slogan, no advertisement. When I hung it up, my hands trembled slightly, not from fear of failure, but because I was touching a part of myself that had been neglected for far too long. On the first day, no clients came. I wiped down the desk, organized old drawings, rehung a few sketches from years ago. The familiar lines made me smile. I remembered what it felt like to create, to decide, to make mistakes and correct them with my own hands, not as someone's wife, someone's mother, but as Audrey White, an architect. Then the first clients arrived, an older couple who wanted to renovate the home they had lived in for 30 years. They didn't want anything grand, just easier movement, more light. I listened to them carefully, not for the money, but because I understood that feeling, the desire to live the rest of your life in a space that truly belongs to you. Work came slowly, but steadily. I chose projects. I declined what didn't fit. I worked at my own pace, morning walks, simple lunches, evenings spent reading or listening to old music. No one rushed me. No one controlled me. My children's lives were different. The corporation Richard left behind didn't collapse immediately, but it was no longer the solid ship it once was. Evan had to sell off assets. Lauren went back to study management. They started over, not easily, not gloriously. We didn't talk much, but I knew that for the first time in their lives, they were living by their own choices, not leaning on their father's shadow or their mother's sacrifice. I don't resent them. I don't cling to them either. Everyone has their own journey. I had finished mine as the self-sacrificing mother. I wasn't going back to that role, not because I didn't love my children, but because I had learned that love does not mean losing yourself. The old phone now sits on my desk. I no longer use it, but I don't put it away. It has become a symbol, not of money, but of awakening. Every time I see it, I remember the woman who once sat in a cramped apartment, frightened, abandoned, yet still standing. And I am grateful to that woman, 70 years old. I don't call it starting over. I call it returning. Returning to myself, to my ability to choose, to a freedom that came late but fully. I live more slowly now, but more deeply. Fewer people, but more honestly. No roles, no obligations to prove anything to anyone. If you are listening to this story and feel something stir inside you, I want to say this. It is never too late to ask the questions, who am I and who am I living for? If you'd like, tell me where you're listening from. Leave a comment. No need to be long, just honest. If this story brought you comfort, please like, subscribe, and stay with me for the stories ahead. Thank you for listening, for walking with me, and for giving me the chance to tell the journey of finding my way back to myself.